The shambler in the attic. Must you have battle in your heart forever, the bloody toil of combat? Old contender, will you not yield to the immortal gods? This nightmare cannot die, being eternal evil itself. The horror, pain, and chaos. There is no fighting it. No power can fight it. All that avails is flight. The Odyssey. Dear James, I write to inform you that your persistent inquiries into the Byron House incident have finally worn away the last threads of reticence I may have developed regarding its open discussion. I have warned you more than enough in my various replies over the past few years. But if you still desire to know the truth of what happened at that accursed house, on that accursed night, read on. I urge you not to do so, however. Some things are best left buried in the past, or in this case, buried beneath the charred rubble and crumbled stone of that hideous edifice. I do not write this letter easily. Even now, the events surrounding that night create a panic that causes a cold dread to creep across my skin. To even briefly recall what I saw on that night, and of the measures I took to end it, causes my mind to unravel in terror at what vague horrors may still lurk beneath the bricks and mortar of that terrible place. Although my account is undoubtedly localized in its scope, it hints at a much larger gathering of nightmarish forces at work in the hidden, shadowed corners of the earth and beyond. The lurking unknown that lairs in the twisting vistas of the deepest cosmic spheres and the lightless chasms of the unnameable blackness of the outside. I have long since burned all my diary entries detailing Byron House and my subsequent correspondences with occultists, pseudoscientists, and fringe scholars from across the globe. All that remains is the very letter you now hold in your hands. Because I have destroyed all written record of what happened at the house, I am relying purely upon my memory to recount the shadowed details. The horrid truth is that I have forgotten much of it, and what remains feels like little more than the fevered hallucinations of an oversensitive and morbid imagination. It may be for the best that I struggle to remember the exact facts of the matter, a blessing for the both of us, in fact. I will now detail for you that terrible chain of events that led me to soak the attic room of Byron House in gasoline and burn the building down to cinders, free of all its occupants, save one. You may recall that I have always held an interest in the afflictions of the mind and a morbid fascination with those poor souls with which such illnesses hold enthralled. Well, in my younger years, before I became a doctor, and was still very much under the subjugation of academic studies, I took on the role of an orderly at Byron House. For me, then, the job was more than a way to pay my university fees, but a way for me to get close to that unseen world of lunacy and madness. Byron House had once been a home for the elderly, but was closed for unknown circumstance, only to be bought and reopened privately by one Dr. Samuel Monroe as a home for the mentally ill. I knew of the house long before I ever worked there. Everyone in Barton did, I think. In my childhood, it served perfectly as the quintessential haunted house for me and my small coterie of friends. Whereas they looked upon the building as a means of acquiring a cheap thrill, calling the staff and residents names before running away, I looked upon it with a chilling but irresistible dread. Even then, the macabre held me in its grip of fascination. It wasn't wraiths bound in chains or moaning specters that captivated my imagination. No, Byron's phantoms were bound in the crippled gray flesh of those elderly inhabitants. I would watch them, shambling around its gardens, waiting, perhaps even hoping, for death to swoop down and take them. I sat for hours, motionless behind a hedge, and watched their frail, brittle bodies wander around the wide lawns, seemingly unaware of the moribundity of their surroundings. I made a vow to myself one day that I would never allow old age to take me. I was determined that I would die relatively young and energetic, better to go suddenly in the throes of youth than slowly rot away within the walls of a tomb like Byron House. Time has passed, however, and I have failed to keep my vow. Many times I have considered taking my own life, but something has always pulled me back from the precipice of saturnine thoughts. I started my job as a fresh-faced, naive youth, eager to learn all I could from some honest hands-on experience. There were 12 inmates at the house, each laboring under a complex cocktail of mental disturbances and psychoses. The inmates were overseen and cared for by 8 staff members of various rank. At the very top there was Dr. Monroe, while at the bottom there were the orderlies like me. The conditions of the inmates ranged drastically, from hysteria, monomania, and psychopathy to feeble-mindedness and retardation. My fellow workers were likewise a mixed bag. One that really stood out was Williams, an ape of a man whose large frame was well suited to restraining rampaging inmates, as well as beating them on occasion, if the rumors about him were true. Another standout was Jane, a well-mannered but somewhat jaded divorcee approaching 50. Jane was part of the government's new nurse training program, and she was always on hand to offer advice regarding administering medication, but there was no warmth in her towards the inmates, and I often wondered why she chose this kind of career for herself. Then there was Dr. Monroe, a distant and stern figure. I got the impression that he in some way resented his position at the house, and he was rarely seen outside of his office. In addition to those 3, there were several new starters, some students like me, and some more local strong-arms who were only good for lifting and carrying uncooperative inmates. I regret that I cannot remember any more names or faces, despite the impact it has had upon my life. My time at Byron House was mercifully brief. Now I said there were 12 inmates, and at first that is what I thought when I started my job. I quickly learned through staff gossip and whispered hearsay, however, that a 13th inmate was being treated at the house. A rare and special inmate, whose condition was so extreme that it demanded constant specialized care from Dr. Monroe personally. I eventually learned that this inmate's name was Jonathan Spencer. He was ominously nicknamed 13 by the staff, and he resided at the very top of the house in the attic space, which had been specially renovated to accommodate him. Unlike the other inmates who were permitted to occasionally visit their families, 13 never left the house. He never even left his attic room, and all the staff except for Dr. Monroe were forbidden from going to the top floor of the house. Jane once told me a story about a young girl who had come to work at the house several years ago as a porter. She had been working the graveyard shift, and Monroe was away on a rare occasion hosting a lecture at Manchester University, leaving her on her own. She had heard 13 banging around upstairs, and despite being told to never visit the top floor, she decided to go up to the attic to make sure everything was okay. Upon investigating, she had run screaming from the house into the night, never to return. After that time, Monroe became even more paranoid about exposing Spencer to the rest of the staff, and would often sleep over at the house in his office to ensure that a similar incident did not occur. Although she didn't like Monroe, Jane was happy that the grim man spent most of his time at the house. It meant that she didn't have to deal with 13 in any way. As far as she knew, Spencer had always lived in the attic, even before she came to work there, which had been a great deal longer than she cared to admit. Williams didn't have much to say on the matter. He seemed to think that 13's condition was more physical than mental, that it was his body that was deformed rather than his mind. Even though the man was large and not afraid of any of the other inmates, he would grow nervous when working the top floors of the house. Monroe was quick to inflict Williams upon unruly inmates, but as much of a lackey that he was, even he was not permitted near the attic. Between myself and the other orderlies, 13 was a source of constant gossip. None of us had ever seen or even heard him, and apart from that one singular horrifying moment in time that I endured, none of us would ever see him either. My own curiosity regarding the attic and its occupant grew by the day, but Monroe was protective, fanatically so, when it came to Spencer's care. Despite volunteering to help, the doctor would just brush aside my inquisitiveness with an annoyed wave of his hand. As fate would have it, I was permitted an entrance into that insane dark world where few among mankind have tread, and it happened sooner than I thought it would. It was December, and I had been working at the home for a little under 2 months when Jane came into the staff room one morning with a cup of coffee, a pack of cigarettes, and a look of pure vexation on her ashen face. I had never noticed that she smoked before that day, but she had been in the room no longer than a few seconds before she had lit up a slender white stick and slumped down in the chair opposite me. She didn't talk to me straight away, or even look at me. She just sat down, almost as if in shock, and drank from her coffee cup and took the occasional long, languid pull from her cigarette. I tried several times to ignore her and go back to reading an article that had caught my interest, but my gaze was always drawn back to her wide, unblinking eyes. "Okay," I said, folding the paper and slapping it down on the chair next to me. "What is it? What's wrong?" I had developed a casual friendship with Jane, despite her being my senior, and we often talked in a direct, no-nonsense manner. She finished her cigarette and immediately lit another before answering my questions. "I was on shift last night," she said quietly. "I was working the graveyard. I'm having to cover for a staff absence." "Oh, whose?" I sat up interested. "Monroe. He's got a virus and can't risk passing it on to any of the inmates, especially." She paused for a few seconds. 13? I prodded. She didn't say anything. She just nodded slowly. I didn't question anymore, as I could tell that whatever ordeal she had gone through the previous night, she wasn't keen on elaborating further. I sat for a few minutes and pondered. This was my chance, I thought. I had been curious about 13 for a while, and I had hoped to get involved in his care. With Monroe away and off sick, a window of opportunity had opened up before me. "So," I said, startling Jane out of her thoughts, "I take it you're having to work tonight too?" She grimly nodded with a sense of total defeat. "Well, I could always work instead. I don't mind. I've even asked Monroe a couple of times if I could assist with 13. You see, I'm writing a paper for college at the moment, and..." She cut me off and stood up out of her chair. "Really? You wouldn't mind? Are you sure?" "Of course," I replied. "Although Monroe has probably asked you to cover as you're the most senior member of staff. I'm not sure he would be pleased if he found out we had swapped shifts." She thought for a moment before replying, "Well, I won't tell him if you don't. I can pay you directly from my pay packet. No need to change the rota." I nodded in agreement. "It's settled then. You finish here early and I'll stay on to work the night shift. I may need to quickly go home and grab some things, but it won't take long. I live quite close." The relief that washed across her face was at once pleasant to see, yet also concerning, for I knew that should I go through with my offer, a good night's sleep would not be on the cards. She perked up considerably and continued to work for the rest of the day, planning to leave a little before 7 p.m. She was good enough to provide me with a list of chores I would need for the night shift, and I spent the rest of the day working my usual rounds. I don't think the impact of what I had offered to do had truly sunk in, and I remember feeling more excited than anything else. As the daylight hours gave way to the dark of the December evening, the rest of the staff left one by one, not too long after Jane had departed, and it was only then that the situation dawned on me. Williams shot me a cruel look on his way out that made me uneasy and left me to ponder if he knew more about what was in store for me than he had let on during his various digs and jibes made at me during the day shift. I had never worked the graveyard shift before. Others had, of course, and they had said that despite his unsociable nature, the presence of Dr. Monroe was always a reassuring one. At least having a normal person in the house with you was comforting, with the added bonus that, as a trained doctor, he could handle any situation that might arise from the myriad possibilities available. But as night crept on and the inmates were safely restrained in their rooms, I began to feel an oppressive cloak of loneliness wrap heavily around my shoulders. At 9 o'clock, I prepared medication and a light supper for Spencer, the details of which Jane had written down for me, along with instructions on how to offer them to him. The meal consisted of nothing more than a plate of scrambled eggs and some fresh orange juice with a straw. The medication, too, was simple: some pain relief, nutritional supplements, and allergy treatments. There was nothing in the medication that would suggest a psychosis or mood-stabilizing treatment was required for him. Whatever 13's disorder was, I thought, it was clear that it wasn't a mental ailment, but something physical that could not be cured, only treated. I wondered how much time the unlucky resident must have left, if indeed he was suffering from a physical disease, as I ascended the stairs with my tray in hand. I paused momentarily at the landing on the 3rd floor and listened for any sound coming from the other inmates. After a few seconds, satisfied that there was no disturbance, I continued. This was the closest I had been to the attic since I started my job, and the thought of venturing upwards filled me with dread. I cleared my mind, however, and shook off my doubts away as I headed for the final set of steps that would bring me to the lonesome attic room. The stairs from the 3rd floor led straight up and then curved slightly as they ascended upward and to the left. They grew narrower the higher I climbed, but the ceiling appeared to lower and grow cramped, giving me a distinct feeling of being boxed in. I stopped as the bend curved around more tightly and finally revealed the entrance to 13's room. I was maybe 10 steps away from the looming wooden door. It had been painted white some time ago, but large chalky flakes had fallen away, revealing the original oaken surface beneath. Just as Jane had described, a small flap had been crudely cut out of the bottom and nailed back on, and it was just wide enough to slide the tray under. The door seemed almost ethereal, as it stood alone and silent at the top of the staircase. It was something that I had only heard of in hushed whispers, but it now stood before me in all its horrid reality. I had moved no more than a single step towards the door, when I heard an excited movement coming from the other side. I say movement, but to be precise, the exact sequence of noises that followed gave the impression of awful, liquescent gesticulations. First, there came a soft thud, as if something had dropped from a small height. The noise was softly muted, as if whatever had landed had been cushioned by thick folds. I thought at the time that this was probably attributed to something like Spencer rolling out of his bed whilst wrapped in thick blankets. But there was a certain hinted wetness about the sound that baffled me. Secondly, and more repulsively, a low dragging sound followed by a labored breathing could be heard. It grew louder the longer I stood, but appeared to take a long time to get to the door. It was as if whatever mass inhabiting the room was closing in on my location with a deliberate, ghoulish lethargy. Horror took hold of my heart, but the rational in me demanded I maintain clear thinking. In a burst of what I can only describe as mad curiosity, I ascended the stairs and set down the tray at the bottom of the door. Then I pushed my body down flat against the stairs, so that my head was level with the half-inch gap between the floor and the bottom of the door. What greeted me on the other side will haunt me until the end of my days, for looking back at me was a set of bulbous, bloodshot eyes. I don't remember running down the stairs, but I do remember going into the ground floor bathroom and vomiting. A silly reaction, you might think, but there was something about those eyes that disturbed me to my very core. It may have been the odd spacing between them, or the way they had seemed to roll around sluggishly and loose in their sockets. For some reason I couldn't banish the thought of a toad or frog from my mind, as if my brain was struggling to conjure up the most obvious terrestrial comparison to the alien eyes that had glared back at me. I spent the rest of my shift in the staff room drinking coffee and waiting for the December sun to rise. When it finally did so, I packed up my things and waited for Jane and the other morning staff to relieve me of my duty. I said nothing to Jane as she approached me and asked how the night had gone. I think I managed a weak smile and a dismissive, "It was fine," before hurriedly leaving the premises and making my way home. As fortune would have it, My week on shift came to an end the very next day, and I spent some free time in total seclusion at my flat. I slept a lot but did not feel refreshed. I could not get those eyes out of my mind, and they continued to haunt me for days afterwards with restless, vivid dreams. When I did return to work a few days later, I confined myself to studying my coursework in the staff room as much as I could. No one bothered me, as I sat in deep concentration over various books and papers. Despite the distraction, I could not banish that awful night from my mind. Dr. Monroe was still off with a virus, so I assumed that the other staff had covered the night shifts during my week of respite. Nobody spoke of or reported any strange happenings or eventful encounters, however. Despite my shock, a morbid fascination was creeping over me. I felt I had seen something not only horrifying, but also enlightening, and my mind burned with the duality of horror and curiosity. My thoughts kept snapping back to those eyes. What terrible affliction could have caused such physical madness of form? If I could perhaps speak with Spencer, especially with Dr. Monroe, currently out of the picture, maybe I could make the unfortunate patient the focus of my academic work. At the very least, I could find some rational and mundane reason that would explain what I had seen that night. A few more days working my ordinary rounds, and my mind was made up. I approached Jane and stated clearly that whilst Monroe was off ill, I would like to personally take over her night shifts in the house, the same deal as before. Unsurprisingly, she was eager to facilitate my request without protest. My next shift began that very night, and I pondered my renewed focus as I prepared the medication and evening meal to take up to the attic. Again, it was a simple setup, some mashed potato and a milky cup of tea with straw. I looked distastefully at the pan of steaming mash and wondered if 13 ever grew tired of the sloppy menu Dr. Monroe had set down for him. All the meals were clearly designed for someone with only the most rudimentary of eating ability. It was more like the kind of food you would feed to a baby than a man. It was all soft puddings, mashed vegetables, and liquid nourishment. With a newly fortified resolve, I made my way back to the attic with my tray, this time without pausing. As I ascended that last set of stairs, something did indeed greet me at the door. It was not an object of terror or disgust, but rather an item that made me immediately question its validity as something that belonged to this exact time and place. It was a small piece of plain paper, a little crumpled and folded crudely several times, and it was sticking out from the gap at the bottom of the door. No sounds came from within the room beyond, and I assumed that 13 must be sleeping. I quietly slid my tray carefully through the flap, as to avoid disturbing the occupant behind the door, and collected the note and the breakfast tray left behind by the morning staff before creeping quietly back down to the staff room. I dared not read the note during the night, just in case its contents caused a disturbance in my mind that would affect my ability to continue working. I placed it into my satchel, noticing a strange, glistening semi-wetness on its surface, and tried to distract myself with some university work, occasionally glancing over at the bag and resisting the temptation to read Spencer's note. In the morning, I did a quick handover with the morning staff and sharply made my way back to my flat. Normally, I would go straight to bed and catch up on some sleep, but instead I put on a large pot of coffee and prepared some toast. Taking my breakfast and the note over to my study desk, I opened the blinds to allow the struggling December morning sun to break into the room, and then sat down and slowly unfolded the paper. Now I would be lying if I was to say that the writing on the note was anything more than childish scrawling, and at first I doubted there was anything of worth to be gleaned from the spidery scribblings. But after several minutes of study and copying words onto a fresh piece of paper, I managed to decipher enough of the contents to read. As I mentioned at the start of this account, I have long since destroyed all written documentation of these events, but I can recall enough of the note to tell you what Spencer had written. I may be embellishing the text slightly, for if you knew what I know, you would find an impossible juxtaposition between the writing and what had written it. As best as I can remember, it read roughly as follows. I apologize if I shocked you the other night or gave you a fright. Please don't feel guilty for finding my appearance shocking. I have long since grown accustomed to such reactions. I can only assume that Dr. Monroe, for whatever reason, is unavailable to look after my well-being, and it is on that assumption that I have seized upon the chance to finally have contact with someone else. I must apologize for my disgraceful and crude writing. My condition makes matters of delicacy difficult, so please be patient. I will not confuse you with the full knowledge at what is at work here, nor my condition or cause of confinement within this house. I freely admit that I do not know exactly where I am, or how much time has passed since I first came to be here, but that isn't important anymore. Unless certain measures are taken care of, I will not be long for this world, and if that happens, it can only mean Monroe has achieved his grand aim. Understand this, the man you know as Dr. Samuel Monroe is not whom he appears to be. In our youth, we were close friends, the best of friends you could say, and together we adventured and traveled among all the forgotten corners and exotic places of the world, the Orient, the Congo, and Arabia. We explored the deepest jungles of the Indian subcontinent, the ancient sands of Egypt, and the forgotten ruins of the Americas. My condition is somewhat linked to these travels, but it is something far more sinister than a mere tropical disease. Now I need to have two things from you, if I may be so bold. I realize you are under no obligation to aid me, but know that if you do, you will not only be doing me a service, but also securing the future safety of all mankind. Firstly, I need you to keep our correspondence a secret. No one, least of all Monroe, must suspect we are in contact. That man is wicked and will seek to do you harm should he discover you have been talking with me. Secondly, I will need you to acquire some items that have been taken from me. Unfortunately, I believe them to be in Monroe's possession. I will tell you more about these once I have received a reply from you. Only then can we move things forward. I am thankful to whatever powers allowed our paths to cross and look forward to hearing from you. The note was fascinating. I reread it several times as my coffee and toast lay forgotten amidst the dozens of questions now burning through my mind. I could not be certain that it was even meant for me, but somehow I grew convinced that it was. The eloquence of the writing was in total contrast to the manner in which it was presented, but it clearly came from a vibrant and sharp mind. As intelligent as the author may have been, it was clear that Spencer was disturbed in some way. There was little doubt that the letter had cast a dark shadow over Dr. Monroe's conduct. Just what sort of wickedness was Spencer implicating the doctor in? True, the man was unfriendly, cold even, and more than a little abrupt. But would he really seek to cause me harm, should he find out I was in contact with Spencer? I simply could not give the idea credence. I was quite certain, at this point at least, that the whole affair regarding Spencer's dislike of Monroe was a delusional fantasy, conjured up by Spencer in the isolation of his attic confinement. After all, was it not only natural for someone with a mental disturbance to project a demonic persona upon those whom he saw as his jailer? Fantasy or not, I decided to follow the advice given to me and not alert Dr. Monroe to my contact with Spencer, if only out of a desire to keep my job as opposed to any kind of fear of physical harm. I wrote a reply that morning and took it up to Spencer when I started my next night shift. Suffice to say, I had agreed to hear him out, but only on the sole condition that he told me all he knew about his illness, so that I could use that knowledge to benefit medical science. Of course, what I was truly hoping for was a unique case to focus my academic studies and career around, and I'm sure on some level Spencer suspected that. Before sliding my reply under the door, I first attempted to make verbal contact. I pressed my head close against the door and simply said, "It's me. I got your note." No reply came. I continued with, "How did you know I would get it?" And, "Can you hear me?" My last question was cut off by a loath, bubbling, gurgling sound, a liquid response that brought bile up to my throat. I fled once more, almost as keenly as on that first night I saw those terrible eyes, and confined myself once again to the staff room, where a cold sweat prevented me from gaining any meaningful rest. Early the next morning, I rushed upstairs before the morning staff came in, and to my relief, there was another note waiting for me. This second letter was shorter than the first, and as I was more accustomed to his writing, I was able to quickly read over it before the day staff arrived. Although shorter, this note was more revealing, and it opened the doorway to the chaotic madness which eventually followed. Overwhelmed to hear that you will aid me. I am a little unsure if you are ready for all that I have to say, but you must be, for my sake, but also for yours. Before that, though, I must address a few things. Last night I was unable to respond to your questions. I did try, but as you no doubt heard, my vocal skills have atrophied to the point of uselessness. I appreciate your keen interest in my condition. I am flattered that you would consider trying to offer treatment or a cure, but I am afraid I am far beyond that. Perhaps a bathe in the waters of Lake Hali in Carcosa, or the medicine of the star scientists of distant Yugath, might avail me, but mere terrestrial treatment is useless. My affliction is just that, a punishment handed down by callous forces that occasionally take an interest in our race. Never to our benefit and always to our misery. No, I am beyond help, but I thank you for the gesture. The items I mentioned in my last letter are as follows. My diary that I kept up until my imprisonment in a manuscript. The latter is of the most importance. Its title is De Vermis Mysterious. Both should be in Monroe's home. You must find a way to get both back to me here as quickly as you can. The next few days dragged on. I knew what Spencer wanted me to do, but I was undecided if I was capable of committing a crime to get him what he wanted. Clearly, he was delusional. There could be no doubt of that, but I was still so keen to learn more about him. Despite his words, I was sure his condition could benefit from study, and it was only the continued imprisonment by Dr. Monroe that stopped the medical community from offering him any kind of aid. I wasn't fully ready to burgle a man's home on the request of a madman. And besides, Dr. Monroe was still off work with a virus, making a midnight trip to his home a risky endeavor. I had no reason to call on him in a social capacity, and I doubted he would even recognize me as a work colleague. Such were the man's ways. I maintained a relaxed correspondence with Spencer, avoiding a direct answer to his request, and instead probing further into his and Dr. Monroe's past. Eventually he grew impatient, and our brief notes started to turn into bitter circular arguments. Spencer's illness appeared to worsen, and he was growing nervous. I was unwilling to rush headlong into a decision regarding recovering his notes and manuscript, and this provoked in him a string of notes filled with venomous scoldings. I admit that during this time I considered dropping the matter entirely and returning to my previous routine of university work, and considered quitting Byron House altogether. Before deciding one way or the other, however, I took it upon myself to do some research without telling Spencer. I didn't have a lot to go on, but I made a trip into the nearby town of Eastwich and consulted the modest library there. I searched for anything that mentioned a Lake Hali, Carcosa, Yugoth, De Vermis Mysterious, and all the other nonsense words that had appeared in Spencer's notes. Of Lake Hali and Yugoth there was nothing. No text on geography, history, science, astronomy, or any other subject known to man contained a reference to either of these words. De Vermis Mysterious was a more successful area of study, and I learned a great deal about this forbidden and cursed tome. It was written in the year 1542 by one Ludwig Prinn, shortly before his death at the hands of the Inquisition. Various translations and copies had been made throughout history, many with strange titles such as the Grimoire or the Saracenic Rituals. Its original Latin title, however, was ominous, translating into something akin to the Mysteries of the Worm. The book seemed to be one of several interconnected volumes, each more hideous in subject matter and scope. Other works were mentioned in the text, books such as Culte de Ghoul, Things of the Water, and that final and most dreadful work of black magic, the Necronomicon. Each book spoke of strange places and strange times, whole cycles of myth, where the earth had been ruled over by old ones and elder things, of the malevolent fungi from Yugoth, of the faceless night gaunts, and of the black goat with 1,000 young, of great Cthulhu, who lay dead, but dreaming in lightless, brine-soaked R'lyeh. I freely admit that most of the works were mercifully beyond my understanding, but still there was an awful sincerity to their descriptions. I pushed such thoughts from my mind. After all, I was at that time a man of science, not sorcery. Still, they lingered in my imagination and have continued to do so every day since. After hours of searching, I also came across a small paragraph in a recently written history book about witchcraft regarding the reign of Queen Elizabeth I that mentioned a certain John Dee as a sorcerer and author of such works as Monas Hieroglyphica and Notes on the Mysteries of the Worm. I made a note of the book's author, a Dr. Harlan Glass, and penned a letter to him the next day, asking if he knew anything about a book called De Vermis Mysteries, but I never received a reply. What kind of forbidden study had Spencer and Monroe been involved in? I had always assumed the doctor to be a rational man, but if Spencer were to be believed, he has once a keen scholar of the supernatural, an explorer of strange, dark places. The day in the library had taxed my mind, and I returned to my flat for an early night's sleep. My dreams, however, were far from restful. I was plagued by a reoccurring nightmare of the first time I had seen Spencer's strange eyes. Chaotic vortices burned into my mind, and I found myself floating through the vast void of space. I knew not how I came to be in the ether, but I had a vague sense of possessing no body, and of being carried on the back of something so sinister I dared not look. The beating of huge wings deafened my ears, and although I had no idea where in space I was, I instinctively knew I was bound for lightless Yugoth, the outpost of the dread sentient fungi. Then my nightmare scene shifted, and I found myself standing at the edge of what I knew must be Lake Halley in Carcosa, dark purple waters lapping languidly around my ankles, thick like syrup but with the stench of 1,000 rotting corpses. Something huge and horrifying rotated slowly in the center of the lake, a colossal tower of plastic flesh that to my horror possessed the mockery of a face upon its surface, and eyes too, the swollen, bulging eyes of Spencer. I awoke suddenly, screaming and short of breath. My sheets were damp with cooling sweat and my head throbbed in pain. I took a week off work to recover, but the nightmares continued to assault me on a nightly basis. Eventually, December came to a close, and Christmas came and went with little fuss. I've never been one to overly celebrate the so-called festive period and spend most of my time alone in my flat or in the local pub. When I did finally return to Byron House, I discovered that Dr. Monroe had also returned to work and was looking a lot healthier, having finally beaten the virus, and he was back to his usual, aloof self. I was somewhat relieved, as his presence made contact with Spencer impossible and beyond my control, something even he would be forced to accept, as it seemed he was as afraid of Monroe discovering our contact as I was. I wasted little time. By now, I had become obsessed with gaining more knowledge about De Vermis Mysterious and its contents. I didn't for one second believe that anything I had seen in my dreams or read in various books on necromancy and witchcraft to be true, but rather, I saw it as a means of further understanding more about Spencer. My desire to write a paper on him had been renewed by my sudden plunge into his supernatural interests, and I felt confident I could write a groundbreaking work on supernatural monomania and hand it in confidently to my tutor. I had finally decided to go ahead with Spencer's wish and steal back his diary and manuscript. Not to hand over to him, of course, but for my own personal study. Once I was done, I could simply sell the book and make a bit of cash in the process. By all accounts, it would be worth a fortune to the right buyer. I knew my time at Byron House was coming to an end. First semester exams were looming, and I would need to quit my job in order to focus on my studies. In a few weeks, I would be away from Monroe and Spencer and back into the sanity of regular student life. Greedy for knowledge, I therefore decided that breaking the law was worth the risk and set about planning my theft. I started to follow Monroe home on my days off. Despite recovering from his illness, he seldom stayed the night over at Byron House. No doubt he was still recovering on some level and wished to sleep in his own bed. This would make things difficult, of course, but I was confident his stubbornness would cause him to quickly lapse back into his old habits. I would wait for him just out of sight and then carefully shadow the man until I became familiar with his routine. Fortunately, he did as I suspected he would, and started spending more time at Byron House. Eventually, I chose a night to break into his home. It was a freezing January night when I made my way over to Monroe's large detached house on Town Court Lane. The night was clear and painfully chilling, and the moon and stars were shining down brightly from the void above, momentarily bringing back memories of my recent nightmares. I won't make too much of an ordeal about my burglary, and I'm certainly not proud of it. Despite being a total amateur, I managed to scale the large brick wall at the back of the residence, and using my jacket wrapped around my hand, punched my way through a small glass plate fitted into the kitchen door. Wasting no time, I pulled out my pocket torch and systematically searched the downstairs rooms. It wasn't long before I came upon a study. There was a strong musk permeating the whole room, which I attributed to the stuffed animals and ancient tomes that littered the walls. Hundreds of large, heavy books were held up by sagging shelves that almost seemed to creak and moan under the weight. I searched the largest of the bookshelves, trying my best to find the tome I needed. The books were in no order and heaped upon each other in a haphazard fashion. Among the mundane volumes on history, anthropology, and geography, there sat several dark and sinister texts that I had seen mentioned in my time at the Eastwich Library. There was Unaussprechlichen Kulten of von Junst, Conte der Letz Kult de Ghoul, and the dreaded Saleno fragments. Most of these forbidden texts appeared to be modern translations, but at least one of was frighteningly authentic and ancient. It didn't take me long to find De Vermi Mysterious. I slid the crumbling manuscript out of the shelf carefully, the remaining books gently toppled into the vacant space it left behind. I doubted if Monroe would even notice a particular volume missing in all this chaotic cataloging, but I quickly rearranged the shelf, so no noticeable gaps were present. I noticed another, slimmer black-bound volume tied to the back of manuscript, and a quick check confirmed this to be Spencer's diary. I silently praised Monroe's sense of propriety. Despite his disorderly collection, he must have known how important Spencer's diary and notes on the manuscript were. Unable to contain my curiosity, I opened De Vermis Mysteries and glanced over the spidery text inside. Unfortunately, the manuscript was far too complex to decipher, with its archaic Latin, and so I concentrated instead on the more accessible, but no less mysterious journal. I was confident that Monroe would not return home, and the house had no close neighbors. So by the light of my pocket torch, I sat at the study's large desk and read. The journal detailed the various travels that Monroe and Spencer had undertaken as young men, and it appeared that the latter had been true to his word in his note describing these adventures. The diary spoke of an ancient cult that the two had come into contact with during their sojourn in Central Asia, a place, or perhaps even a time, known only as Leng. It also spoke of a secret order of undying monks who guarded a fabulous treasure that lay in the center of a great stone monastery. This treasure, a large golden idol of a winged hound, was a powerful artifact, capable of opening the way for the old ones locked beyond our reality. They guarded this treasure from all would-be thieves, such as the fearsome Cho-Cho, a race of semi-human cannibals, as well as the dreaded spiders of Leng, sentient arachnids with their own designs for mankind. The old ones appeared to be Monroe's main motivation concerning the cult. In particular, he appeared to be opposed to them in some way. Spencer seemed much more interested in the cult's mysterious powers. As I read on, I learned more about their dealings with the monks and the secrets of immortality that they could induct outsiders into. It seemed that Spencer did indeed get his wish and meet the deathless leaders of the group, but that the meeting had gone sour, and in retaliation, he decided to steal the golden idol and make his escape. Monroe was reluctant to go with him, but being guilty by association, was forced to flee for his life. During the trip back to England, the two had been in constant disagreement as to the idol's fate. Monroe wanted to be rid of the thing, but Spencer refused, saying that the black secrets contained within would allow them to live forever, as gods upon the earth. At some point the two parted ways, Monroe with the idol and Spencer with nothing. He grew deeply paranoid and furious with Monroe's departure, and became convinced that either the cult or Monroe had placed a curse on him, and spoke first of the symptoms that no doubt manifested into his current condition. I tried my best to locate the idol, which was drawn on a diary page with great detail, but my efforts were fruitless. I suspected that Monroe may still possess it, but that it must have been hidden somewhere in his house, or even his office at Byron. Regardless, it was time for me to leave. I didn't sleep well after reading Spencer's diary. The nightmares grew more vivid and intense. I felt as if I was being plunged into gloomy Erebus, my tormented soul nightly assaulted by every blasphemous revelation that the diary had revealed. The morning I was due to attend my last shift at Byron House, I sat and pondered over an untouched cup of coffee. I had read much in the past few weeks, and although I was certain that the whole matter of magic and old gods and Yuggoth was purely fanciful, I couldn't detach a dreadful sense of realness from the topics I had read. If everything written down in that diary was true, then it would appear that Monroe had put a stop to Spencer's plans of immortality and locked him up in the attic to cease whatever menace he may have been to mankind. Due to my nightmares, however, I was quickly growing tired with the whole affair. It was taxing my mind to breaking point, and my studies had suffered because of it. I reasoned that if some insane inmate wanted his books back, who was I to deny him? Better to be rid of the things and banish all thoughts of elder gods and old ones from my mind and get back into my studies, forget about the whole thing and my involvement in it. Secretly, I had thought about putting the books back in Monroe's house, but it had been clear that he knew about the burglary due to the smashed window I left behind. He seemed to be spending more time at home now, and I heard a rumor that he had acquired a rather large German shepherd to guard his home. Having possession of the books would clearly mark my guilt. On the off chance he suspected me, the local police would not have to search my tiny flat long to find them. I could have discarded them, but that felt irresponsible, given their contents. Plus, my fingerprints would be all over them. Selling them was an option, and my original plan, but I pondered upon what kind of person would be interested in obtaining the book, and to what purpose. Plus, they could still be traced back to me. You may think I was being paranoid, but at the time I did not want to risk the chance, no matter how unlikely, that I could be linked to criminal activity. I snuck the manuscript in Spencer's diary into one of my folders and went to work. At the earliest opportunity, when the other staff were busy and there was a lull in activity, I marched up to the attic, and after a moment's hesitation, I placed both the diary and the De Vermis Mysteries in front of the door and knocked once before briskly leaving. I worked sporadically at Byron House from then on. I had planned to quit, but a few extra shifts came my way, and I was in no position to turn down the money. I found a way to juggle the work with my studies, and I took day shifts only. Slowly, the nightmares stopped, and I was able to get adequate rest. I looked forward to passing my exams and starting a new semester at university, and it felt as if normality was returning to my life. However, I noticed a strange change in Monroe as the days went by. He was showing signs of severe stress and appeared to be growing weaker as time passed. The virus that had plagued him a few weeks ago appeared to be back, and I even saw him cough up a small measure of blood into his handkerchief. His entire demeanor took on a somber appearance. Great black rings formed around his eyes, and deep wrinkles appeared to be manifesting upon his brow. Not only did he come across as a man ravaged by illness, but also a man worried out of his mind. He was less abrasive than usual, and even attempted to make some light conversation with the other staff in an almost resigned and defeated way. Eventually, he got so ill that he once again had to leave work, only this time he never came back. We received the news a few days later that Dr. Monroe had died of heart failure, nothing unusual given his age and recent stress, but still it unnerved me greatly. His death plagued my mind, for if what I dared suspect was true, then I had somehow played a part in his death, and so had Spencer with that damned manuscript. Now, James, we are coming to the end of my story. It has taken a while to get to this point, and I admit that I may have stretched out the affair longer than I intended. If I have, it is only because I dread writing that which must be written down. It is the only way you will understand. As I did at the start of this account, I now urge you to consider not involving yourself any further in this matter. Put the occult and witchcraft far to the back of your mind. There are things mankind cannot know. Black magic is truly the devil's work, James. If you are so inclined, you can do your own research on the history of Byron House. If you do so, you will learn that one February evening around 60 years ago, the house was burned down to its foundations, with only one casualty. You may also learn, too, that not long after, Dr. Monroe's house was broken into, and a large portion of his private book collection burned to ashes on his back lawn. No one was ever caught for these crimes. There were suspects, of course, disgruntled ex-employees, former inmates, perhaps even a naive and young orderly studying psychiatry at the University of Manchester. But the police failed to ever nail down a perpetrator. I am an old man now, and my mind is not as sharp as it once was. Nevertheless, I will recount the horror as full as I can, and maybe then you will give up this investigation of yours. Once a month, the staff and inmates at Byron took a trip into the countryside as a reward for good behavior, so that everyone could benefit from some good old-fashioned fresh air. Spencer was exempt from these trips, of course, due to his physical limitations, and would have normally stayed behind with Dr. Monroe, whilst the rest of the house went out. However, with Monroe gone, none of the staff were willing to stay behind to see to Spencer's needs, and instead a tray of food was to be left outside of his attic door. The staff and inmates then left the house for a few days. I had made it clear that my college studies needed some serious tending too, and I would be unable to work at Byron House any longer. I left not long after Dr. Monroe passed away, and never stayed in contact with Jane, Williams, or anyone else from the house. Confident that one of the fellows I now shared my student accommodation with in Manchester could provide me with an alibi should I have need of one, I took the train from Piccadilly to Eastwich. I then took the last bus to Barton, and I waited for Williams, Jane, and the various inmates they looked after to leave the premises and allow me to make a concealed entry. It was with a heavy heart and a troubled mind that I once again ascended those lonely, sinister steps that led to the attic. By this time, the nightmares had returned, only now they featured the tormented spirit of Monroe, crying to me from beyond the grave. I admit to you fully that I may have been in the grip of madness myself at this time. For what sane man would have done what I did on that chill February night? I was convinced that the fate of all mankind was at stake, that Leng and Yugoth and Carcosa were all very much real, and that the old ones waited patiently in their ancient prisons to descend once more upon the earth. I cannot say to you that I do not still believe these things, but that is my burden, not yours. As I summed up all the courage I could muster and stood before the door, a voice slurred forth from beyond. To this day I cannot say if I truly heard these words, or if they just appeared in my mind, but those liquid syllables, slimy and slopping, spoke to me, and I dared not answer back. You, done well, the key mine. Monroe denied, killed him, called it down from the stars. Ritual, soul is nectar to the gods. It fed of him. Elder ones feast now. Monroe burns, body returning. Freedom, your help, you're next. My head spun with confusion and my heart pounded with fear. In one mad burst of fury, I kicked down the door and gazed upon that which had once been Jonathan Spencer. What did I see? It's difficult to truly describe with justifiable detail. But what I did see caused me to flee the attic in a fit of howling madness and return with petrol and matches. Whatever it was, I was convinced that only the purifying touch of fire could erase its horrid monstrosity from the world. For floundering on the attic floor there laid a vast mass of gelatinous, rotting fungoid flesh, quivering under the weight of its own hideousness. Parts of it lay splashed upon the ceiling and the walls, but the bulk laid upon the bare attic floor in bubbling pools. Unblinking, bulbous eyes rolled around the shuddering mound before locking upon me with the intensity of a dying star. Appendages and pseudo-appendages formed and spurted up from within, only to collapse into mounds of hideous protoplasmic tissue that continued to squirm of their own accord. I think I saw a face, or at least the parts of a face, crawling somewhere upon the surface of that blasphemous bulk. It was a rancid thing that had labored under the curse of Leng for more than half a century. A blob of squirming meat that was the laughing, gibbering, mocking form of Jonathan Spencer, inmate number 13, the shambler in the attic. Walking the line, I awoke in a standing position, my eyes suddenly shooting open and my legs weakening as I began to stumble. I panicked as I felt myself falling forward, instinctively reaching out to grab the nearest thing to hand, which happened to be the shirt of the guy standing in front of me. "Watch it, buddy," he exclaimed in annoyance, although the mystery man did take hold of my arm and shoulder before helping me to steady myself. "Are you okay?" he asked sympathetically. "Yeah, I think so," I replied through trembling lips as I tried to get my bearings. "Well, just keep your cool," he instructed, "and whatever you do, don't step over the white lines." I didn't understand what he meant, but then I adjusted my eyes and surveyed the scene around me, and what I saw was a vision of hell. I hadn't seen the face of the man who'd helped me, but when I looked up, I could make out the back of his head in the darkness, and realized he'd turned around after assisting me, now facing forward. Darkness was all around me, but there was a dim illumination on the ground which I stood upon. 2 lines of white light about 3 feet apart, one to the left of me and the other on my right. I remembered what the man had told me a moment earlier, warning me not to step outside of these lines. I didn't know what he meant, but somehow realized this was probably good advice. I creaked my head to one side, looking over the shoulder of the man ahead, and seeing a line of people standing in front of him, a long single-file queue of shadowy figures stretching for several hundred yards, up what appeared to be a slight elevation. All stood within the 2 white lines which seemed to operate like some kind of emergency lighting, and at the top of the queue of unidentified figures was a doorway of bright, almost blinding light, a literal beacon in a sea of darkness, inviting, comforting, and offering a glimmer of hope in what otherwise seemed like a dangerous situation. I didn't understand what this place was or why I was here, but in that moment, I believed the shining white light ahead was my salvation. There were dozens, maybe hundreds of people standing in the queue in front of me, and I couldn't move past them without stepping outside of the white lines. I shook my head, experiencing an almost crippling anxiety as my mind raced to make sense of this inexplicable situation. I opened my dry lips and struggled to speak, addressing my fearful question to the anonymous man in front of me. What is this place? How did we get here? He didn't turn his head to face me, but the man did respond. You see the white light at the front of the line? He asked in a surprisingly calm voice. Yes, I confirmed nervously. Well, look behind you, he instructed. I was terrified, but needed to know the truth, and so I turned my head, making sure to keep my footing and stay within the lines as I did so. Directly behind me stood a woman about 5'5" tall. I could barely make out her features in the dark, but, in any case, her head was down, and it appeared she was unconscious. She was sleeping while standing up, just as I had been only moments before. I guess this was the same for every person in the line, and that we'd all been unconscious when they brought us here. But who had done this to us, and why? I decided this was a question for later. I suppose I should have paid more attention to the sleeping woman behind me, and if I'd done so, I would surely have recognized the young lady, but my attention was drawn to the scene beyond her. I soon realized I was standing in the middle of a long queue that stretched back for at least several hundred yards and sloped downwards. And at its end was the polar opposite to the light before me. At the very bottom of the line was a swirling vortex of crimson red, a terrifying portal to God knows where, so vile and sinister that I couldn't bear to look upon it for more than a few seconds. If the light before us offered hope and salvation, the blood-red whirlpool surely represented doom and despair, and the mere sight of it chilled me to my very bones. I turned back around, muttering a profanity under my breath as my body shook. It gets worse. The man in front said ominously, "Look ahead." I creaked my head once again and saw a terrifying scene unfolding. I guess another man had suddenly woken up like I had, but he didn't react well to his surroundings. I watched in awestruck horror as the darkened figure stumbled, swearing as he put his foot forward and stepped outside of the white lines. Someone else in the queue tried to stop him, reaching out to grab the disorientated man while shouting, "Don't do it, man. We can't leave the queue no matter what." But the well-meaning person's efforts were in vain, as the man he was trying to save ignored the warning, slapping his hand away whilst shouting, "Get away from me, you damn freak." And then he put both feet across the line on his right-hand side and walked out into the darkness. I say dark, but I could still make out his shape once he was over the line. He was a big guy, over 6 feet in height and well-built. I guess he didn't scared easily and thought he could find a way out, but he didn't get far. I guess he was about 10 yards out before they got him. Thankfully, I couldn't see much in the dim light, and it all happened so fast, but the creatures that emerged from the black void were horrifying, imp-like demons the size of grown men, but with eyes which burnt a deadly shade of red, and with claws and teeth like those of the deadliest predators. There were 3 monsters in total, and they all roared like lions, moving so rapidly as they surrounded the doomed man and tore at him with their long and sharp claws. Their victim screamed in absolute terror as the monsters ripped his clothes and skin. Next, the horrified man tried to fight and make his way back to the relative safety of the queue, but soon he was knocked over and seriously wounded by a deep slash along his back. Even then, he didn't give in, crawling along the hard ground as he desperately cried for help. Not one person attempted to reach him, however, as all remained frozen to their spots. And of course, he didn't make it. A moment later, one of the demons grabbed him by the legs, pulling his body away from the line as he screamed and tried in vain to dig his nails into the ground. Before long, the monsters and their victim disappeared into the darkness. We could no longer see them, but we did hear the vicious attack reaching its horrifying conclusion. The doomed man screamed louder as his predatory attackers growled with sadistic glee, and then I heard the appalling sounds of skin ripping, bones cracking, and finally, what I can only assume was the noise of the monsters feasting on his still warm flesh. What the fuck? I swore aloud. I retched, feeling like I was going to be sick, but nothing came up. Panic soon spread along the entire line as people reacted to the vicious killing we'd all just witnessed. Some deteriorated into screaming hysterics, whilst others fell into themselves, whimpering or quietly praying under their breath. But all were in agreement on one point. We must not step outside of the white lines. Stepping out of the queue meant certain death, while within the lines we were safe, for now at least. I shivered as I tried to come to terms with the extreme violence I'd just seen. It seemed like the temperature had suddenly dropped, or perhaps this was just my brain's perception. In any event, my mind was now racing, and I wanted to ask 100 questions at once. I noticed how the man in front of me had hardly reacted to the savage attack. It was like he'd expected it to happen. I also recalled how he'd helped me when I first woke up, but I was still to see his face, and even now he would not turn around. He'd been the one who'd warned me about the rules, and that simple advice had probably saved my life. Nevertheless, I had the distinct feeling that his faceless man knew more about our situation than he'd shared thus far, and so I was determined to ask him further questions. But before I got the chance, I was disturbed by a soft cry from behind me. I jumped in shock and turned around, almost accidentally putting my right foot over the line before I stopped myself. Once I'd turned, I saw the woman behind me slowly falling, and I reached out to catch her, taking hold of her slender body and helping her back up to her feet. I felt a familiarity as I held her in my arms. Perhaps it was her scent, or maybe my muscle memory. But then she lifted her head and met my eye, and I almost jumped out of my skin once I saw her face. "Sally?" I said in astonishment, as if my eyes were deceiving me. "Joshua?" she answered weakly, as she opened her eyes and slowly adjusted to our new environment. I saw her dark hair tied back in a bun, her soft skin and her expressive green eyes, and knew it was indeed her. And Sally's presence in this hellish realm brought the terror I felt to a whole new level. I held onto Sally's body as she regained her composure, and continued to do so until she was able to stand on her own 2 feet. And I was still thinking of what to say as I looked into her frightened eyes, and a flood of old emotions came back to me, some good, others bad. In the end, I could only repeat the crucial advice I'd been given, saying, "Don't step outside of the lines, Sally. Whatever you do, stay inside the lines." Sally looked up at me in confusion, and I was prepared for a stream of follow-up questions which I likely couldn't answer. But before we got the chance to speak, the man in front of me spoke, asking, "Do the two of you know each other?" Yeah. I answered without thinking. "Sally and I used to date." Interesting," the man replied without elaborating. He was still facing forward and so couldn't have seen Sally falling into my arms. He must have been reacting to the sound of our voices and eavesdropping on our conversation. Meanwhile, Sally adjusted to our terrifying situation, looking ahead at the light and back towards the vortex. Her reaction was much the same as mine, as I saw her face contort with horror and confusion. "Where are we?" she asked, looking to me for answers. "That's what I'm trying to find out," I replied, before turning back towards the man in front. "Hey, buddy," I said. "You know our names. How about you tell us yours?" The man still refused to turn his head, and he didn't speak for a long time. But finally, he did answer my question, saying, "You can call me Milo." "Okay, I replied hesitantly. The name rang a bell somewhere in the back of my mind, but I didn't dwell on it. Well, Milo, how about you tell us what the hell is going on? I demanded. What makes you think I know anything? He replied cryptically. I think you know more than you're letting on. I said, you told me about the lines after all. Fair enough, Milo admitted. I know some things, but not everything. He paused before continuing. You wake up in this queue standing between the white lines. You know what happens when you step outside of them. Sally didn't, not yet anyway. I was grateful she'd been spared the sight of the savage killing. What are those things out there? I asked, although a part of me didn't want to know the answer. Milo shrugged his shoulders, but still didn't turn around. Can't say for sure, he said. They could be demons, monsters, aliens, or genetic mutations. In the end, it doesn't really matter, does it? I know they dwell in the darkness all around us, and they see everything. For whatever reason, they can't step inside of the lines. We're safe from them as long as we stay in the queue. But if we enter their domain, they'll slaughter us without hesitation. I turned to Sally, seeing the fear in her eyes. That's a look I hadn't seen in a long time and hoped I would never witness again. I put a hand around my ex's shoulder to comfort her, but she pushed me away, and I was forced to remember why we'd broken up in the first place. I put this to the back of my mind, however, instead focusing on my inquisition of the faceless man in front. So, we're trapped here? I asked fearfully, the desperation now evident in my voice. Oh no. Milo answered in an almost flippant tone. I'm afraid you don't understand. The queue won't remain stationary. When the trumpets blow, we move forward, one at a time. When the trumpets blow. What the hell did that mean? I thought about it for a moment before I realized the implications of what Milo was saying. You mean we move towards the light? I asked hopefully. I knew little about our situation, but surely the white light at the top of the queue was our chance at salvation. Yeah, that's what happens. But there's a catch, Milo said. What do you mean? I demanded in angry frustration. You'll find out soon enough, was Milo's typically evasive response. I opened my mouth to speak again, but then I heard it. The trumpets, blaring from God knows where, a deafening and terrifying sound which blasted out from the darkness, seemingly surrounding us on all sides. Both Sally and I collapsed down to our knees, covering our ears with our hands in a futile effort to drown out the awful din. I felt the pressure building inside of my skull and thought my head was going to explode, but thankfully the trumpet stopped after a few moments, and then the line started to move. I looked forward and saw the figure at the front of the queue stepping into the light, his dark silhouette immersed as he raised his arms and cried out in glorious ecstasy, gladly allowing the portal to transport him to another realm. And with that, he was gone, freed from this nightmare and surely now safe from the monsters that dwelt within this dark hellscape. Wow, I expressed my amazement. But, as Milo had warned us, there was a catch. Suddenly we heard a blood-curdling scream from behind us, a cry of abject terror emitted by somebody in mortal danger. I swiftly turned my neck, seeing how Sally was already facing in that direction. My eyes widened in terror as I saw the man at the back of the line, his body being physically sucked into the swirling vortex of crimson red. He continued to scream as his legs were pulled inside, and soon he was up to his waist, reaching out desperately and digging his nails into the frozen dirt beneath him. Please, please help me, he cried. There was a woman ahead of him in the line, and, to her credit, she did try to help. Reaching down, she grabbed his hand tightly, but the pull of the hellish vortex was too great. Within minutes, she lost her grip upon him, and the man was sucked through the portal. I remember the look on his face the second before he disappeared into the abyss, his eyes so wide and his mouth frozen in a silent scream. And then he was gone. The middle-aged, slightly overweight woman who'd tried to save him suddenly cried out, as something inside of her just broke. "I can't do this. I can't be here," she exclaimed. And before anybody got the chance to stop her, the frightened woman did the worst thing imaginable. She stepped over the white line. There was nothing we could do but watch as the poor woman attempted to run into the darkness. Inevitably, she didn't make it far. The attack didn't play out like the previous time. She wasn't set upon by a gang of savage monsters, but instead confronted by a single creature which suddenly emerged from the black abyss to block her path. The woman just froze, stopping dead in her tracks as she stared into the monster's burning red eyes. She was seemingly unable to flee or fight, as if the beast had her under its terrible spell. My jaw dropped as I observed the unreal scene. For a moment, I naively thought she might be okay, and that the monster would actually let her live. But then, in a single rapid and brutal action, the beast raised its muscular arm and thrashed out with its claw, easily cutting the woman's jugular wide open. She grabbed at her throat as blood poured from the gaping wound, and soon collapsed heavily to the floor. Her body continued to thrash as she choked on her own blood, but a moment later, and the beast leaned down and grabbed hold of her hair, dragging the slowly dying woman into the darkness. "Oh my God!" Sally cursed under her breath, and I couldn't utter a word. This was the second person I'd seen slaughtered by the monsters stalking the shadows. But it didn't get any easier. Frightened murmurs and the occasional scream went along the line as all present reacted to the horrors we'd just witnessed. Those who hadn't seen the deaths firsthand no doubt heard about them from their neighbors in the line, and the panic spread like wildfire. Still, I noted how Milo had not reacted at all to the bloodshed. Still, I reckoned he must have eyes on the back of his head, and perhaps he'd seen it all before. Nevertheless, our mysterious companion was able to provide an explanation of sorts. That's the catch I was telling you about. They let one person pass into the light whenever the trumpets sound, but there's a price to pay. One goes into the light, and the vortex takes one from the back of the line. That's the way it works. Suddenly I felt cold all over. I was sure the temperature had dropped since I first regained consciousness, although this was the least of my worries as my exhausted brain attempted to process what Milo had just told us. I'm sure Sally was doing the same, as she remained silent for the time being, although I could hear her clicking her tongue, a habit she did when nervous or stressed. I glanced ahead and behind me, once again confirming that we stood roughly in the middle of the long, single-file queue of people. If what Milo said was correct, one person would reach salvation at each trumpet blow, while one would simultaneously be sucked into oblivion, or whatever the hell lay on the far side of that damn portal. Assuming this twisted process continued, the line would gradually grow shorter as more people left this shadowland, and in the end, we too would discover our fate. I felt a vile sickness in the pit of my stomach as my whole body shook. I didn't know what to say next, but it was Sally who broke the silence. "Hey Milo, that's your name, right?" she shouted over my shoulder. I saw Milo nodding in confirmation, but he still wouldn't turn to face us. "You know, you still haven't answered Joshua's question. You didn't tell us where we are and why we're here." Milo snorted before replying. "Like I said, I don't know everything. But I guess I've been conscious to our situation for longer than the two of you. During that time, I've come up with a couple of theories." "Like what?" Sally demanded. I could tell she was becoming increasingly impatient. We'd been split up for 2 years at this point, and hadn't spoken in nearly as long. But seeing her again in this dangerous and terrifying situation made me realize I still had feelings for her. Milo eventually replied in a matter-of-fact tone, with no emotion evident in his voice as he spoke. "Well, one possibility is that we've been kidnapped or abducted by some malicious person or persons. What's the last thing you remember before waking up here?" I tried to think, realizing there was an unexplained gap in my memory. "I remember driving," I said uncertainly, and then everything went black. This didn't make sense. Had I been in an accident? If so, why didn't I recall a crash or collision? I have the same memory, Sally muttered nervously. I glanced back at her in confusion, only to find she wouldn't meet my eye. This revelation confused me even more. Sally and I hadn't been together. We hadn't even seen each other in 2 years. What were the odds of us both being involved in car accidents at the exact same time? And all this talk reminded me of the incident which had led to our breakup in the first place. I'm sure Sally was thinking the same thing, but we'd both promised to never speak of that night again. So, if we were abducted, then who has us? Sally continued. And why are they doing this to us? That's the $1 million question, Milo replied. It could be aliens, I reckon. Or maybe it's the government running a psychological experiment, or some sick billionaire who tortures people for fun. But of course, there is another possibility, one which is more supernatural in origin. I stared at the back of Milo's head in astonishment, irritated that I couldn't see his face and tell whether he was serious or not. There was a tense pause while I waited for Milo to elaborate, but to my surprise, it was Sally who spoke up next. You mean that we're dead, she said ominously, that every person in the line is deceased and trapped between heaven and hell. Her chilling words hung in the air as we considered the terrifying inference. It's a possibility that's occurred to me, Milo responded dispassionately, breathing life into the horrific theory. So, if we really are dead, Sally continued, the white light means salvation while the whirlpool means eternal damnation. Milo didn't answer her question, but the conclusion Sally had come to seemed like an obvious one. Still, there was something that I just couldn't understand. But the people at the front of the line are guaranteed to reach salvation, while those at the rear will surely get sucked into hell, I exclaimed. Why are some saved and others doomed? I waited for an answer, but a moment later, and the trumpet sounded once again, forcing us to cover our ears and making further conversation impossible. And of course, the whole ritual played out again, as a solitary figure gladly walked into the light, while the poor sap at the rear was pulled into the whirlpool, screaming in abject horror as the vortex took him. The line had become slightly shorter, and it was now clear to everyone standing in the queue what was going on here. The fear in the icy cold air was palpable, and soon the line behind us descended into panic and chaos. I heard shouts and screams, looking back over my shoulder to see violent scuffles breaking out, as desperate souls tried to fight their way forward and put as much distance as possible between themselves and the vortex. The results were tragically inevitable. The white lines were only 3 feet apart at most. If people had been more cooperative, they could have slipped past one another and reorganized the line in a sensible manner. But nobody wanted to be left at the back of the queue when the dust settled, and so fights broke out. Desperate struggles that resulted in several people being thrown over the lines on either side. And of course, the monsters were there waiting. A dozen or more demons emerged from the shadows, roaring with fury as their red eyes burned with an intense hunger. The scene that followed was worse than anything we'd seen thus far, as ravenous monsters greedily tore into their near-helpless victims with claws and teeth. I couldn't bear to watch and so turned around, but I could still hear the screams and the awful sounds of ripping and tearing. Thankfully, the massacre soon ended. I guess that those at the back of the queue realized it was futile to try to fight their way forward, and so they stayed within the lines where the demons couldn't reach them. But suddenly, a horrifying thought crossed my mind, and I turned to speak with my ex-girlfriend. Sally, who is standing behind you? I asked in a panic. It's okay, she replied. There's a woman behind me, but she hasn't woken up yet. Her head's down and her eyes are closed. I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking that Sally was safe, for the time being at least. What about you, Milo? I said, addressing my question to the faceless man ahead of me. "Don't worry about me," he replied firmly. "I know how to look after myself." I had little doubt this was the case, and of course Milo was ahead of us in the queue. None of us said anything for a time, but once again our attention was drawn to the front of the line, where there was an unexpected and gut-wrenching development. We heard the sounds of an argument from the two people at the head of the queue, a man and a woman by the sound of their voices. Their conversation was muted at first, but soon grew louder, enough so that we could hear from a couple of 100 yards away. I don't know whether the two knew each other outside of this hellscape, but they were having a heated discussion, with the man wanting to take action and the woman being against it. Finally, the man cried out in defiance, shouting, "Screw it! I'm not waiting a moment longer. I'm going through." With that, I saw the man charging towards the white light, determined to make it into the portal. But what happened next was horrific. The man didn't pass through a porous membrane like the others. Instead, he charged into a wall of flames, screaming in total agony as his skin and flesh burnt fiercely, and within seconds he was engulfed by the unholy inferno, his body reduced to mere ashes. The man's female companion yelled out in grief, and the rest of the line fell into a chilling silence. "We've all got to follow the rules," Milo muttered solemnly. "There are no shortcuts." For once I understood what he meant, and my jaw dropped when I considered what had just occurred. The man at the head of the line had suffered an agonizing, fiery death, and all because he was impatient. If only he'd waited until the trumpets blew, he would have safely crossed over to paradise. Slowly but surely, the line moved forward. We were now one step closer to salvation, but no one was likely to make the same mistake. Nevertheless, the situation continued to develop in an unexpected way. We heard muttered chatter from all along the line, dozens of separate conversations but which surely related to the same topic, survival. And then something extraordinary occurred. People began to swap places in the queue voluntarily, carefully pushing past each other whilst ensuring that nobody stepped outside the lines. There weren't many changes to the prearranged order, but there were some, and these transfers were apparently done after mutual agreement and without the threat of violence. I was astonished, particularly when I saw the bald-headed man who now took the unenviable position at the very end of the line, but he did not seem afraid of his imminent damnation. Instead, he sat down cross-legged on the cold ground, his form illuminated by the burning red of the vortex. I watched as he closed his eyes and remained perfectly still, as if in a deep meditation. I couldn't understand why at the time, but he seemed to have accepted this fate. And with that, the ominous trumpets blared, drowning out all other sounds as the now familiar cycle played out once again. I guess the woman at the top of the line had recovered from seeing her male companion burnt alive, because she slowly and carefully stepped into the light and safely passed through to the other side. And meanwhile, the bald-headed man at the rear maintained his monk-like composure right to the very end. He didn't fight or even scream when the vortex sucked him in, and his limp body disappeared into apparent oblivion. I shook my head in disbelief. It was clear that something significant was happening here, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was and how it impacted on us. But Sally was quicker off the mark, which I suppose I should have expected. She'd always been smarter than me and knew how to cope in a crisis situation. I'd learned as much during the incident 2 years before. Still, as well as I thought I knew my ex-girlfriend, I never could have predicted what she'd do next. "Hey Milo, how are you holding up?" she said suddenly. I looked over my shoulder in confusion, only to see my ex giving me a knowing look. I'd seen that look before and knew what it meant. Sally wanted me to trust her and keep my mouth shut, and so this is what I did. I suspected she wanted Milo to turn around so she could make eye contact, but by now I knew this wouldn't happen. For whatever reason, our mysterious new friend was determined to keep his eyes facing forward. "I'm doing just fine," he answered, a response which struck me as odd. "Why do you ask?" Sally seemed frustrated by Milo's reply, but she persevered nonetheless. "Well, I feel like the three of us are in this together," she said. "But we know nothing about you, Milo. As you know, Josh and I were in a serious relationship. Things didn't work out, but we're still close, and we share custody of our son." I spun around in shock, opening my mouth to challenge my ex. But when I did so, she shot me a hard look and raised a finger up to her lips, silently telling me to stay quiet and go along with this. Obviously, Sally was lying. We never had a child together. We talked about it, but our relationship ended abruptly soon after the incident, and our dreams of having a family died at the same time. But now Sally was claiming we had a son together. I didn't understand why she'd made up this fictional child, but I soon found out. "You have a son?" Milo asked hesitantly. "Yes," Sally replied without delay. "His name's Kevin and he's 2 years old. A real rascal sometimes, but he's as sweet as punch." I was shocked by how deeply invested Sally was in this lie she'd manufactured from thin air. It was frightening how she was willing to add details to make it sound more convincing. I was driving to pick Kevin up from my parents' house when all this happened. I just hope he's not too upset and wondering where his mummy is. She let this sentence hang in the air for a moment, I guess for the maximum emotional impact. I couldn't bear to look at my ex-girlfriend and didn't wish to be part of her deception. And yet I couldn't bring myself to speak out against Sally, because I realized I still owed her a massive debt. Milo hadn't responded verbally to Sally's words, but she eventually followed up with a question. "Do you have children, Milo?" she asked purposefully. Milo's reply surprised me, because his usual cool demeanor broke down and he suddenly became upset and angry. "No," he spat. "I never had any kids. My wife and I wanted to, but we never got the chance." I think Sally was taken aback by his emotional response, but she soon regained her composure and continued with her ruse. "I'm really sorry to hear that, Milo," she said in what I knew was mock sympathy. "But we do have a baby boy, and in a situation like this, don't you think parents should get priority?" All of a sudden I got it. I guess I was slow to understand what my ex was doing, but Sally always said I wasn't the sharpest knife in the drawer. Milo was in front of both of us in the line, so he would reach the safety of the light before we did. We might survive either way, but Sally was hedging her bets, trying to get Milo to voluntarily switch places so a loving parent could survive and get home to her child. I guess this lie was meant to help me as well, but I still didn't like it. We'd told too many lies already, and there had to be consequences for our deception. Nevertheless, I didn't say a word, instead waiting for Milo's response. But before he had an opportunity to answer, the trumpet sounded once again. As we covered our ears, the familiar pattern took place before our eyes, with one figure stepping into the light and another getting sucked into the vortex. In the aftermath, an individual broke from the line and stepped into the shadowy kill zone. I was shocked to see this figure was little more than a child, an adolescent boy with wild terror in his eyes. I didn't see whether the kid was pushed or if he ran, but he was quick on his feet and seemed determined to make a break for it. Inevitably, a gang of 3 bloodthirsty demons emerged from the shadows and grasped out at the kid with their claws, but amazingly the kid dodged all of them, making it past the trio of monsters and sprinting into the darkness. He disappeared from sight, and for a brief moment I thought he could actually make it to safety, but then we heard a blood-curdling scream closely followed by the cracking of bones and the ominous sound of a huge beast biting into flesh, and I realized that the kid had fallen victim to some yet unseen horror lurking in the shadows. My heart sank at that moment, but Sally's devious plan was still very much in play. Milo predictably didn't react to the kid's violent death, but he did recall the conversation we were having before the trumpets sounded. So, You think you should go ahead of me because you have a kid? He asked, his voice returning to his characteristic emotionless tone. I remained silent, but Sally spoke up on our behalf. Frankly, yes. I don't want to be brutal about it, but we deserve the chance to see our boy again. But if we really are dead, then what difference does it make? Milo blurted out. I had to admit that he had a good point here. I didn't know how Sally would respond to this direct question which poked a massive hole in her story, but of course she had a pre-prepared argument. But we don't know that we're dead. Not for sure. If we have been abducted, then reaching the light could bring us home. And besides, even if we have passed away, don't you think two loving parents deserve to go to heaven? I didn't know how Milo would react to this loaded question, but I certainly didn't expect what happened next, because suddenly Milo began to laugh, quietly at first, but growing ever louder. But his laughter wasn't one of mirth. Instead, it was filled with bitterness and scorn. I turned around to look upon Sally, only to find she was as baffled as I was. We had no choice but to wait until Milo finished his mad cackling and opened his mouth to speak, his voice now filled with passionate anger. You really don't know who I am, do you? I hoped there would be some recognition, some remorse, but now I realize this is beyond you both. I shook my head in confusion, feeling like there was something I should have picked up on, but sadly I remained oblivious. I'm sorry, Milo, I don't understand, I said nervously. You don't, huh? Milo spat back. Well, maybe it's about time you saw my face. And with that, he slowly began to turn around for the first time. I stood there in nervous anticipation, my entire body trembling because I suspected what we'd see would not be pleasant. And when his face was illuminated, I recoiled in horror as my most painful memory came back to punch me in the gut. Milo's face was in actual fact a grotesque death mask, his dead eyes bulging and his forehead caked in dried blood. His skin looked like leather, and when he opened his crusty lips, green water poured from his mouth and nostrils. I heard Sally scream behind me, and I was about to follow suit. But, in that moment, the trumpet sounded, louder than ever this time. I fell to my knees and buried my head in my hands, but the almighty din was too intense. I felt like my head was about to explode, and then I found myself drifting out of consciousness, as suddenly my whole world went black. And then I was in another place and time, thrust back to a point in my life that I had tried my hardest to forget. Sally and I were in my car, driving along a lonely country road late at night. We were coming home from a party and were in high spirits. We'd both been drinking. I was driving and surely over the limit, but I'd made this journey a dozen times before and thought it would be fine. I remember the two of us laughing over a shared joke. I glanced over to the passenger seat, looking into Sally's mischievous eyes and feeling so much love for her at that moment. But I should have kept my eyes on the road because I didn't see the pedestrian until it was too late. A sudden panic overtook me as I slammed my foot on the brakes, but I hit the man head-on, horrified as his broken body was thrown up onto the hood before it smashed against the windscreen. I brought the car to a stop as the body fell heavily to the ground, and I sat frozen, still gripping a tight hold of the steering wheel and in a state of shock. Slowly, I turned to look at Sally and saw an expression of sheer horror etched across her face. "Joshua, what have you done?" she whispered, and I didn't have an answer. After some time, we exited the vehicle and went to see my victim. What we found was a bloody mess of a man, a human body broken almost beyond recognition. We were both sure he was dead. Sally and I stood there under the headlights on the side of the abandoned road, looking down at the corpse of the young man I'd just run over, and then I really started to panic. "Sally, what the fuck am I going to do?" I exclaimed. "I've killed a man. They'll send me to prison for this. That's not going to happen." Sally answered firmly, her eyes narrowing as she took control of the situation. There are no witnesses. Nobody saw what happened. She paused briefly, letting those words sink in. The lake is only 5 miles from here. We can make him disappear. I glared at her in shock and disbelief, disgusted by the suggestion. But of course, I went along with her plan. I didn't wish to face the consequences of my actions, and so I conspired with my girlfriend to cover up the crime. With some difficulty, we lifted the body and loaded it into the trunk of my car. I vividly recall seeing the man's grotesque death mask, his dead eyes looking upwards into the night sky as we slammed the trunk shut and sealed him inside. We drove to the lake, exiting the car at the top of a disused jetty after releasing the handbrake, watching in solemn silence as the vehicle rolled downwards and disappeared under the water's surface. Sally and I made the long walk home that night, barely speaking a word as the seriousness of our crime hit home. We reported the car stolen the next morning, Sally giving the report to a disinterested police officer who didn't ask too many questions. A few days later, we heard a missing person report on the news, a young man who had been walking at night and never made it home. In the days and weeks that followed, I lived in a state of constant anxiety, forever fearing a knock on the door. But the cops never made the connection and didn't find the body. I guess it was about 2 months later when Sally and I were watching TV at home, and suddenly there was a press conference featuring a teary-eyed woman giving a statement with a photograph of the missing man framed behind her. She pleaded for anyone with information to come forward and wept as she begged for her husband to come home. And the missing man's name was Milo. Suddenly my ears were filled with the sound of trumpets, and I was brought back to the dark hellscape, except the circumstances had changed during my absence. The first thing I noticed, before I even opened my eyes, was the overbearing heat. Before, this place had been ice cold, but now the opposite was true, and simultaneously my nostrils were filled with an awful stench of sulfur and burning flesh, making me retch in disgust. But when my eyes opened, I almost jumped out of my skin, and I started to stumble until a pair of arms grabbed me and held me up. "Remember the rules," was what she shouted in my ear, her voice just about audible over the almighty din. "Stay within the lines, and they can't get you." That was Sally, and she had a tight hold of me. I glanced into her wide eyes, wondering if she'd experienced the same gut-wrenching flashback I had during our blackout. The look of horror etched on her now drawn face told me she surely had. But this wasn't the reason she was so frightened. The demons weren't in the shadows any longer. They were standing right up beside us, so close that I could smell their foul breath, which stank of rotting flesh, and see the flesh blood dripping from their sharp fangs. There were 6 of the beasts visible on either side of the white lines, appearing like soldiers standing to attention. They didn't make any attempt to attack, but the monsters shot us murderous glares through their burning red eyes, and they grind their razor-sharp teeth and click their long claws, as if eagerly anticipating the kills to come. But they couldn't get to us, not as long as we stayed in line. And the queue was much shorter now. I guess Sally and I had been out for longer than I'd thought, as we relived our past sins. Because, whereas the line had once included hundreds of lost souls, now there were only 5 of us. The doorway of white light was right in front of us, while the crimson vortex lay behind us, the 2 gateways competing to drown out the darkness. But the intolerable heat and disgusting stench came from our rear, and I had no doubt that the vortex was a portal to hell itself. In the moment which followed, the terrifying process repeated, as the anonymous figure at the front of the line crossed over, and the woman behind Sally screamed as the hellish whirlpool sucked her inside. And then there were only the 3 of us. In all the chaos, I'd almost forgotten about Milo, but the ghoul was still facing us, his dead eyes burning with rage as he savored his moment of retribution. "Tell me," he snarled through his rotting maw, "do you 2 feel any guilt? Any remorse for what you did to me? For what you took from me? I struggled to find the words to respond as I experienced a foul, burning sensation in the back of my head. I knew I couldn't hide from this any longer. Milo, I spluttered. Of course we're sorry for what happened, but it was an accident. You've got to believe that. Milo laughed bitterly once again. An accident, he exclaimed in anger. Was it an accident when you bundled me into your trunk and pushed your car into the lake? Was that a fucking accident? He paused briefly, his lifeless eyes narrowing. I was still alive when I went into the water. Did you know that? I shook my head in disbelief, muttering, "No, that's not possible." "It's true," Milo confirmed with a nod. I slowly suffocated to death inside of that trunk, and they never found my body. My wife never got closure, never got to bring me home, and that's all because of the two of you. Milo was now beyond fury as he roared and charged toward Sally and I with his arms outstretched. "Josh, stop him," Sally screamed, but he was already upon me, his skeleton-like hands wrapping around my throat in an attempt to throttle me. I fought back with all my might, tackling Milo and shoving him to one side, and of course he fell outside of the lines. Milo released his grip on my throat as the demons grabbed hold of him, their eyes lighting up with a ravenous hunger as they dug their claws into his flesh. Milo didn't fight or scream when they took him. He merely looked upon us with a sad resignation as they dragged him into the darkness. I glanced down at my own hands in disbelief, realizing that I'd killed this innocent man for the second time. The rest of the demons retreated at this point, cackling cruelly as they returned to the shadows. As I watched them go, I felt an immense guilt eating away at me, and I knew that it should have been me. It was Sally who broke me from my trance, placing a firm hand on my shoulder and forcing me to look her in the eye. "Joshua, are you doing okay?" she asked sympathetically. I shook my head, muttering, "I'm a killer." "You did what you had to do, Josh. You were trying to protect me, but I need your help one last time." "What do you mean?" I shot back in confusion. She sighed deeply, probably frustrated by my lack of awareness. "Come on, Josh. There's only two of us left now. What's going to happen when the trumpets sound?" And suddenly I was up to speed. I was standing in front of Sally in the line and was closest to the white light of salvation. "You want to swap places?" I said ominously. "You want me to sacrifice myself for you?" I wondered what I thought about this idea. It certainly wasn't an appealing offer. I was terrified by the vortex and whatever hell lay beyond it. Of course I was. But would I screw over the woman I'd once loved to save my own skin? It had never crossed my mind that it would come to this. But I think Sally had always envisaged this outcome. Sally had always been one step ahead. And in the end, she had the words to persuade me. My ex held my hand tighter, tears in her eyes as her tone became increasingly emotional. "I know it's a lot to ask, Josh, but remember, I saved you after the accident. You said you couldn't face prison and I made the problem go away. I don't deserve to suffer for your sins. You know that, Josh." I opened my mouth to respond, but we'd run out of time. The trumpets blared aloud, drowning out our conversation. I needed to make a decision right now, and I went with my heart over my head. In an instant, I grabbed hold of Sally's waist, embracing and kissing her once last time, before pushing her ahead of me in the line. The terrible din made any further words impossible, but in the last moment, Sally smiled back at me gently and mouthed, "Thank you." And as she did so, I remembered all the tenderness and love we'd once had for each other. But I couldn't escape the nagging suspicion that she'd played me. But Sally didn't wait, soon turning her back on me and confidently walking into the light. And then I felt the irresistible pull from behind me as the all-powerful vortex sucked me in. I felt my skin burning and the air leaving my lungs, and then I was gone from that place, never to return. I didn't know exactly what to expect once I regained consciousness and adjusted to my new environment. I knew it wasn't going to be a good place, but my panicked mind was filled with images of burning lakes of sulfur and sadistic demons wielding pitchforks. But the space I found myself in was quite unexpected. I was inside of a car, sitting in the driver's seat. But it wasn't just any vehicle. It was my car from 2 years previous. The same car I'd been driving on the night of the accident. The night I'd killed poor Milo for the first time. And that wasn't all. I was underwater, surrounded by dark flowing liquid on all sides, with the only illumination coming from the light above the dashboard. I started to panic, struggling to breathe as I desperately tried to open the doors, only to find they would not budge. Next, I kicked out at the windscreen, which was already shattered from the night of the accident. But when I kicked the glass, I discovered it was rock hard and unbreakable. I cried out in angry frustration, slamming my fists on the wheel and hearing the muffled sound of the horn. But then I was taken unawares by a chilling, deep voice from behind me, saying, "I won't bother if I were you. There's no way out." I jumped up and turned around, seeing a dark figure sitting in my back seat. I knew he hadn't been there a second before, and so he'd seemingly materialized out of thin air. The man, if that's what he was, appeared well-dressed in a finely tailored tuxedo suit, seamless white shirt, and black bow tie. But I couldn't see his face as it remained hidden in the shadows. Thus far, he'd only offered me what seemed like advice. Nevertheless, there was something very disturbing about his tone of voice and whole demeanor, and so I guess this mysterious individual was no friend of mine. I felt like history was repeating itself and feared the worst, struggling to speak through trembling lips and asking, "What is this place?" "Isn't it obvious?" the shadowy figure replied. It was, of course, and I needed to face the grim reality of my situation. "I'm in hell, aren't I? This is my personal hell." The shadow man responded with a sly chuckle before saying, "Certainly not Joshua. This is a halfway house of sorts. Call it purgatory if you will. Believe me, you'd know if you were in hell." I experienced a wave of emotions in that moment, relief for sure, but, as always, I was confused. "I don't understand," I exclaimed. I was sucked into the vortex. I smelt the sulfur, felt my body burning. "You made an assumption," the man replied abruptly. "Did anyone tell you that one portal led to heaven and the other to hell?" I pondered his words for a moment until the horrifying implication became apparent. "Sally," I exclaimed. "What happened to Sally?" The man sighed before answering. "Sally is somewhere else. Don't worry about her now, Joshua. You won't see her again, not for a while anyway." I gulped, feeling a chill as I thought of my ex-girlfriend and feared for her safety. But it seemed there wasn't anything I could do for her right now. "And what about me?" I muttered nervously. "What will become of me?" There was a lengthy, almost unbearable pause before the shadow man answered me. "I'll be honest with you, Joshua. You've got us in a bit of a pickle. On one side, you committed a heinous sin on the mortal plane, but then you made a noble sacrifice in the Shadowlands to save a woman you once loved. Your sacrifice was futile in the end, but you weren't to know that. We're going to need some time to consider your fate, Joshua. In the meantime, you can stay here, in this watery prison of your own making." I experienced a renewed panic and also anger, crying out before I had the chance to think. "No, you can't keep me here. I won't stay." The shadow man's reaction was instant and furious. He leaned forward, allowing me to see his hideous eyes through the darkness, burning crimson orbs that reminded me of the vortex I'd been pulled into, mesmerizing and yet terrifying at the same time. And when he spoke, his voice blared out like a banshee's wail. "You'll do what we damn well tell you," he screamed. "Do not test me, you wretched mortal. I can make all your worst nightmares come to life." I'd never been as frightened as I was at that moment, not during my mortal existence, or even in the Shadowlands. Whatever this entity was, I realized he could inflict suffering upon me that I couldn't even imagine. I had no words to respond, and so I merely grabbed hold of the steering wheel and lowered my head in a meek submission. "Very well," the Shadow Man said with a smug satisfaction. "Goodbye, Joshua. Until we meet again." I nervously glanced up into the rearview mirror and saw the entity melting away into the leather seat. And then I was alone. To this day, I remain trapped in this watery grave, staring out at the bottom of the lake, which was the scene of my worst crime. I don't know how long I've been here. All I know is that I can't leave, not unless they set me free. I assume the Shadow Man will eventually return to reveal my ultimate fate. But for now, all I have is time. I've had what seems like an eternity to come to terms with what I've done. I think about Sally often, and Milo too. Will I ever see them again? I hope so, because when all my sins and regrets are washed away, all I want to do is make amends. It came from above. He could feel his stomach almost twist as the aircraft started its long ascent into the sky. He was already holding onto his seat. Yet now he couldn't help but tighten his grip even more. How long had it been since he'd last been on a plane? A good 15 to 20 years. Perhaps. Probably that much. Reflecting on this question distracted him from the reality he had to confront. From the fact that he was now soaring high above the clouds, and that was something he could definitely live with. "John? Honey, are you feeling all right?" You look so pale." A voice caused him to snap out of his thoughts. Leaning over him was his wife. "Anne, no. Hussy, I just haven't eaten much today. That's all," he replied. Damn it. Why did he have to get the window seat? At first, before boarding the plane, he had tried to offer it to Anne, making it seem like a sacrifice on his part. Say, "Anne, I'm willing to offer you my seat by the window, so just tell me if you want it. My wife deserves the best." He smiled, but his smile soon turned to a forced one, as he heard Anne tell him that she didn't really want to deprive him of his benefit because, frankly, she didn't really find sitting by the window all that special. Besides, there's a good chance of me getting nauseous from the view, so I'll have to pass, she added. He had never told her about his fear of flying, a fear rooted deep within him since his childhood. The heights weren't the source of his fear, though. No, it was something far more sinister. He shuddered at the thought of even trying to recall the incident that had scarred him for life. The seatbelt icon was now switched off. A flight attendant carrying a little basket was distributing hard candies. It wasn't long before she reached the couple's row. "May I interest you in some candy for your clogged ears?" she asked politely. Anne was already sucking hers, but he was reluctant. "It's on the house, sir. Offered by us. To you. Completely free of charge." The flight attendant had a puzzled look on her face. John knew that she had to move on to the rest of the passengers, so he had to hurry up and not make the situation more awkward than it already was. He heard Anne scold him. "John Calver, for God's sake, she's talking to you." She then proceeded to turn to the woman standing above them, basket in hands. "Please excuse him. I don't know what's gotten into him today," when she referred to him using his full name, like his mother used to do back when he was younger. She was usually pretty annoyed by what he had done, but it wasn't that John thought the candy wasn't free and that caused him to have second thoughts about taking it, as the stewardess had assumed. He just felt that something was off. Not something about the whole candy thing per se, but something was certainly bugging him. He extended his arm and grabbed one. The woman rushed to the remaining rows to provide the other passengers with candy as well, some of which were eyeing John suspiciously. "What was that all about?" asked Anne, angrily. Great. All he needed now was a fight with her. As if his stomach getting even tighter wasn't enough. "Sorry, I'm just not feeling very well. I'd better get some sleep." Anne backed off a bit, seeming a little worried. "Are you sure that's all there is to it? Did anything happen to you while I was looking away?" Her interest was genuine, and that fact alone moved John. But cold sweat had already started dripping down his back, and rational thinking wasn't an option for him. Neither was sentiment. Yes, Just, just leave me alone. Will you? Oh, that was all he could bring himself to mutter. In hindsight, his reply seemed way more hostile than he had intended it to be. And Anne was clearly picking up the vibe as well. Fine. I never should have bothered to check on you in the first place. Awesome. Now she wouldn't talk to him for the rest of the flight for sure. But that was the least of his worries. Why couldn't he bring himself to tell her how he felt? Tell her about his absurd fear of airplanes. About how he was nervous but couldn't quite pinpoint the reason behind that feeling. No, he couldn't do that. He was a man with pride in him, and he couldn't simply let himself come across as weak, especially to Anne, whose dominant behavior often caught him by surprise. He turned to the side, trying to find a more comfortable position to sleep, hoping that the window being there wouldn't unnerve him as much as he thought it would. It was stormy outside, and the occasional lightning bolts jolting through the clouds, almost as if they were racing each other, illuminated the dark clouds around them. He tried not to think much about his circumstances. Not that he didn't know that he'd wind up all nervous like this prior to the trip. But at least he'd hoped for his fear to have grown smaller over the years, though this apparently wasn't the case. But he had promised Anne this trip to New York, and he couldn't back out of it now. Could he? As he started dozing off, he caught a glimpse of something big on the other side of the window. He felt his heart skip a beat, reluctantly. He peeked outside. It was just the aircraft's wing. Get it together, Calver. You coward. His seat next to the wing was surprisingly comfy, so it didn't take him long to fall fast asleep. He woke up in an airplane, but not the one he was in before. It seemed older, and significantly less roomy. Above him was a woman dressed in a dark blue uniform, an ascot tied around her neck. Would you like to come over, little one? She said in a charming voice, her eyes fixated on John. Little one? He wasn't even that short. He was about to give her a piece of his mind, when he heard a familiar voice next to him. Come on. John answered to the nice lady. He turned around. Mother? His long-gone mother, in the flesh, was sitting there. Next to him. What was going on? He tried to say something, but his voice wouldn't come out. It was as if he had no control over his actions, save for changing his visual perspective. And then he looked at his arms, his small and childlike arms. To be precise, the right one sporting a Disney-themed band-aid near his elbow. And then he realized what was going on. It couldn't be. All these years had gone by, and all that had remained in his head from that fateful night was his irrational fear. But the scene in front of him was so vividly reenacted that he doubted whether his adult life was only a fabrication constructed in his head, and that this was the actual reality. No, it couldn't be. He kept repeating that phrase in his head. The only logical conclusion was that he was having a dream. Yes, that was all. A dream. A bad dream. A nightmare surfacing from the part of his memory he so desperately tried to seal away. Indeed. His theory was confirmed when he anticipated that he knew how the events unfolding in front of him would play out. The woman, who he by now had understood was a stewardess, invited him once again to join the pilots in the cockpit of the aircraft, an invitation which his younger self happily accepted, despite his older incarnation trying desperately to stop him. If only, back then, he knew what was to follow. Well, this whole cockpit thing must be a practice probably utilized by airlines so as to come across as family-friendly to their clientele. He thought to himself, what was he even doing? Thinking about trivial stuff like this. He had to prevent the nightmare from reaching its conclusion. No, he didn't want to have to confront it again. He tried to wake himself up, but his efforts were in vain. He could only watch as his tiny feet dragged him all the way to the cockpit's door. It was as if his body was one with that of the younger John's, only that it was intangible and unresponsive. The stewardess pulled the door's handle, and the door gave way, squeaking open. I've brought a young fan, he heard the woman say, as she made her way out of the room again. A lot of flashing buttons and equipment, the purpose of which he had no idea, surrounded him. He couldn't make much out by looking through the windshield, other than that it was pitch black and that it was raining heavily. It was at this instant that he felt a chill run down his spine. but he didn't have any clue as to why. No, he knew why. He just didn't want to acknowledge it. The pilot was the one to speak first. "Hi there, champ. What's your name?" he asked in a friendly voice. "J. John," his younger self replied. The co-pilot didn't utter a single comprehensible word. However, all he did was mutter some gibberish into a strange device installed on the control panel in front of him. The device would do the same every now and then, and the two seemed to be going along pretty well in terms of things to discuss, albeit in this weird manner. The adult John immediately understood that the man was simply communicating with ground personnel via the radio. Nothing to be alarmed about. The boy seemed hesitant, but the pilot soon won him over by explaining how everything worked. Heck, he even let him mess around with the plane's steering wheel, or whatever that thing is called. Naturally, the adult incarnation of John figured that said wheel was probably deactivated beforehand, and that the co-pilot had control of the aircraft at the time, which would explain his tendency to only speak to the radio, and not him, or, more accurately, the younger him. John had failed to contain his dream, and there he was, right at the part where things would take a turn for the worse. "What's that?" he heard his young voice say. "What's what?" "John," the pilot replied, "that thing crawling on the windshield." His voice was trembling. "I see no such thing. It's probably just a shadow. Nothing to worry about. Now, where were we?" Yes. This blue button here is to be pressed whenever." The man was obviously a huge fan of his job and took a liking to talk about it. But John wasn't paying attention anymore. He was fixated on the thing. It looked just as he remembered it. A hairy creature climbs up the front side of the airplane, its hands reaching for the windshield. Pure terror was now the only thing John could feel. Not just the young John, the older one as well. The terror kept seeping in as the distance between the creature and the cockpit grew shorter and shorter. He wanted to run away, but his young self's body wouldn't budge, no matter how hard he tried. A sudden burst of lightning illuminated his field of view. He could make out two long, pointy horns protruding from the sides of the creature's head. Its fur was dark brown, and its limbs were identical to one another as if there was no distinction between arms and legs. John was surprised by how sturdily the creature clung to the aircraft, but then he noticed the sharp claws at the end of each of its limbs, which the creature thrust into the aircraft for stability, creating a loud, screeching sound as it moved. The sort of sound you would get if you scratched a blackboard with a fork. Heck, how could these guys not see or even hear this thing? Thankfully, at that point, the younger John deemed it appropriate to close his eyes and cover his ears, much to his adult counterpart's relief. For a while, both remained like this. John couldn't remember what happened after this part. Not that it mattered, since he would have to relive it all over again anyway. The boy opened his eyes just as a blinding light emanated from the glass in front of him. Another jolt of lightning, and just like that, the creature was gone. Absolute silence filled the room. The pilots both seemed to be in a trance now. They kept flying the plane as usual, but it was as if they couldn't notice their surroundings, save for what was necessary to maintain flight at the correct altitude and course. John tried poking the pilot, but he wouldn't move. He just kept staring blankly ahead. John found himself fixating his sight on the dark skies around him as well. It was a sight most mesmerizing. For some reason, he simply couldn't look away. Suddenly, a loud cry sent a chill down his spine. In front of him, just outside the windshield, was the creature. Not surprisingly, the pilots weren't fazed. The creature looked up and straight into the boy's eyes. A grin was present on its face, which allowed John to glance at the several rows of teeth hidden within its mouth, which the creature proceeded to brush over with its long snake-like tongue. And then he was unlucky enough to glance at its eyes. Those red eyes filled with nothing but bloodthirst. John woke up, surprised by how he didn't scream in the process. He was covered in sweat, which was only natural, given that he had just relived the incident that had scarred him for life as a kid. He remembered how everything returned to normal as soon as he ran out of the cockpit in fear and ran into his mother's arms, crying. Nobody would believe his story, and the pilots were now behaving normally again. a fact that destroyed any proof he might have had of the incident. A loud bang startled him. The cockpit's door had flown open and was now squeaking back and forth. He could now feel the aircraft falling to the ground below. He tried to regain his balance and navigate himself around the back part of the plane. Nobody was there. No matter how loudly he called for help, nobody was there to answer. Just where was everyone? Suddenly, something louder than his voice could be heard. It was a man's voice, but not that of a normal man. It was robotic and distorted. John had to move closer to the sound source to make out what the voice was saying. He had to move to the cockpit. He made his way towards it. Its door opened but angled in a way that it wouldn't allow him to peek inside. It was as if the room itself was inviting him to enter, but he didn't need to. He could now make out what the man was saying from where he was standing, and he immediately wished he couldn't. Terrain, pull up. Terrain, pull up. It was the navigation system of the aircraft alarming him of his impending doom. As much as John didn't wish to enter the cockpit, he had no other choice but to take the aircraft's fate into his own hands. He rushed towards the door, a task that proved to be much more strenuous than normal due to the aircraft now spinning out of control. Complete silence was now prevalent. John couldn't even hear the storm outside, nor see it through the windshield. All he could make out was a dark void ahead of him. Even the terrain alert, something you wouldn't expect to suddenly stop working, had ceased to sound. The pilots were not there. John would have to somehow fly the metallic beast to safety, even if he didn't succeed, which would probably be the case. He figured it would at least be better than not trying at all. As he made his way towards the pilot's seat, he was stopped in his tracks by the sight in front of him. He could see his wife's beautiful brown hair extending from the back of the chair. She must have been in deep sleep since she didn't move when he entered the room, even though he made a lot of sound in his attempts to reach the door. And, quite frankly, he hoped she was asleep, because if she wasn't, not now. Calvary, there's no time for this. He whipped his mind back to shape, quickly dismissing the macabre and unpleasant thought. After all, he couldn't tell yet, since he hadn't seen her from the front, and the thought that there was still hope for her filled him with hope as well. Honey? Honey? Are you all right? He whispered. No response. Anne? He exclaimed in a worried voice. It was then that he heard the same robotic voice from before, emanating from a nearby speaker. Cockpit security lockdown initiated, it said. The cockpit's door slammed shut before he could react. The hair from the chair was now withdrawn, as if the one sitting there had moved. He saw a hairy limb grab the chair's arm, thrusting its long claws into the leather. A head slowly protruded from the side of the chair, with a huge mouth bearing several rows of teeth inside, grinning. And then John was unlucky enough to glance at the eyes on that head, those red eyes filled with nothing but bloodthirst. He heard the creature say, "Yes, honey." Now to the next story. Story number 2. My wife won't stop sleep talking. My wife and I moved into our new apartment just a few months ago. Before this, we lived in a large cottage overlooking a beautiful lake. It was my wife's dream home for the 3 years we lived there. We didn't want to leave, but it was a necessary step for us. You see, Jessica and I used to live down south. Everything was going well for a while, but my law firm decided to promote me out of the blue. It was unexpected, but I couldn't have been more grateful. Unfortunately, the job entailed transferring to another one of our many branch locations. The one in question was in New England. We spoke long and hard on the matter, but eventually, Jess agreed to the move. It's important to note that the dollar doesn't stretch as far up north as it does down south. It's also harder to find employment. That's why we were downgrading our living space. Until Jess could find another job, we would have to suffer. At least, that's the way she looked at it. Tensions were high the first few weeks after the move. I could tell Jess was irritable. She missed our old house, our old friends, and working a steady job. She had nothing to do with all of her free time, so she was bored out of her skull. This led to many fights. For a while, it seemed like we would never settle in. About a month after the move, things started looking up. Jess found temporary work as a part-time editor at the low TV station. She loved the work and couldn't have been happier with her co-workers. I couldn't have been happier for her. Everything seemed to be fine for a while. Not perfect, but fine. This was when the sleep talking began. It was to be expected. And honestly, I'm surprised it didn't start up sooner. You see, my wife is a restless sleeper whenever there's a big change in her life. Good or bad. It happened when we got married, when we moved into our first home, and when she had the miscarriage. I'll touch more on that later. Jess knows she sleep talks because I used to bring it up from time to time. I would laugh each morning, recalling the weird things she said the night before. This always made her uncomfortable. She seemed to be embarrassed by it. That's why, after her first night of sleep talking in our new apartment, I didn't say anything. The sleep talking went on for a couple of weeks. It was at this time that Jess' temp job at the TV station came to an end. Without a job to keep her mind off of things, her nightly outbursts became much worse. She began screaming at odd times during the night, in which I would be forced to calm her down. One night, her screams turned into tears. As she was crying, she said something I'll never forget. "You wish you were dead on?" To my surprise, she responded, "You." This caught me off guard. It's a strange thing to want your husband dead, and even stranger while you're asleep. "Why?" I asked. "You're ruining my life." Those 4 words cut deep. Whether they were meant or merely the product of a tired mind, they were the kind of words that demanded self-reflection. I wondered for a moment if I truly was ruining her life, or at least if I were to blame for her night terrors. My wife remained silent for the rest of the night. I know this because I stayed up. Contemplation and worry kept me from a good night's rest. I didn't believe for a second that my wife really wanted me dead, but her late-night antics were certainly a cause for concern. Between the screaming episodes and the morbid dialogue, this was the worst her condition had ever been. The next morning, I came pretty damn close to telling her about what had happened, but I kept thinking about how she'd react and what she'd say. It was too much. I didn't want to burden her any more than I already had, especially after she'd just been laid off. I also didn't want to have another fight. In light of this, I kept my mouth shut. The following night, the screams were gone. This was a comfort, but a fleeting one. Out of the blue, just as I was about to shut my eyes and call it a night, the sleep talking commenced once again. Sometimes I think about how I'd do it. I chalked this statement up to pure dream-induced nonsense. But then she continued, "While you're asleep in bed, I'll get up and go to the kitchen." I didn't know what she was talking about, but as she kept speaking, it dawned on me. There were some moments of inaudible gibberish, but from the bits and pieces that were fluent, I could paint a pretty good picture of what she was describing. Reach into, grab a knife, over and over again. Blood oozing off the bed. Can't ruin my life anymore. My wife was describing her plan to murder me. As deeply unsettling as this was, I couldn't help but chuckle to myself. It was just a dream. After all, nothing more. I can't say I haven't done some weird things in my own dreams, things I would never do in real life. Jess was mad at me over the move, and she was working out her frustrations while she slept. At least that's what I convinced myself. The sleep talking continued for a few weeks. I hoped that Jess' midnight venting sessions were doing her some good, but without a degree in psychology, I couldn't be certain. All I could do was listen to her ramble about offing me each night, and wait for her condition to run its course. The longest her sleep talking had ever lasted was a month, so it was safe to say it would be over soon. A month passed. Then 2. Jess didn't let up. Every night, it was the same routine. Either incoherent nonsense or babblings about how she'd like to hurt me. It was getting old, but one night changed everything. As my wife slept, she uttered some words that tore right through my heart. "I lost my baby because of you." My emotions swirled about and formed a sour concoction that rested in the pit of my stomach. This time, I had to know what she meant. "What do you mean, honey?" There was a brief moment of silence, but eventually, Jess offered me an answer. There was some more gibberish mixed in, but she was able to get her point across. "You made me want kids. You put life in me. Now I'm alone." This struck a nerve and caused a few tears to roll down my cheeks. It was my idea to have a kid. Jess never wanted children, but she made herself want them for me. That's why, after the miscarriage, I was surprised to find her absolutely devastated. I had no clue how much she'd warmed up to the idea of having a baby. My tears were interrupted by more sleep talking, of the worst variety. "I will kill you. I promise." That was the last thing she said all night. It's been roughly a week since my wife made that promise. As disturbing as that threat was, I could have easily brushed it off with the rest, assuming it too was the product of stress and was nothing for me to worry about. Unfortunately, I can't stop worrying about it. Jess is scaring the crap out of me. I'm now taking short naps and sleeping with one eye open. And it's all because of one thing now. She's sleepwalking. Now to the next story. Story number 3. A peculiar kind of madness. I'd always known that my great-grandma was an orphan, but in late October of last year, she decided to tell me the truth about what happened to her family. We were visiting her for her birthday. It was a tradition in our household, a road trip we knew in the back of our minds we'd take only a few more times. She was turning 98, so that was just the cold, hard truth of the matter. In my childhood, the journey to central Iowa had been a fun and light-hearted affair. But now my brother and parents could only maintain strained politeness as we met up and hit the road together. Each of us knew that this trip might be our last. For several hours, we drove through vast open farm fields that stretched from horizon to horizon. My great-grandma's house was down a narrow dirt road off a wide dirt road off a gravel tractor lane. As a city boy, it was more or less the most remote possible dwelling I could imagine. She was born there, had lived her entire life there, and would soon well. As we parked in an open, muddy rectangle and stepped out to stretch our legs, the constancy of the place surrounded me. Every single year of my life, this house and its land had been exactly the same. The sky was open blue, the earth was a sea of waving gold, and the wind was a smooth river of cool warmth. There was never anything to mar those 3 pillars of sensory experience except the house, the barn, a defunct old tractor, and the bell. The bell was a simple thing raised high on an old metal crook. It sat out in the fields about a quarter mile from the house, serving as a measure of the wind. If a storm was coming, the bell was supposed to ring, a necessary precaution in tornado country. The only problem was, the bell and its crook had rusted over long ago. Every time I got out of the family van from age 5 to age 26, I glanced that direction and felt a sense of unease as my gaze fell upon that decayed artifact. This time, at age 27, I looked over and saw that the bell had been scraped and polished clean of rust. It glinted in the sunlight, practically daring me to look at it. I followed my family inside while struggling with a feeling of dread that I couldn't articulate. Who had cleaned the bell? And why? I tried to stop thinking about it as we gathered in the kitchen and said our hellos. My great-grandma was making tea and shooed off our attempts to help. She was a frail woman for whom movement was difficult, but she'd never let that stop her. The Wisconsin Fi password is on a note in the living room. She told us with unquestionable authority, "Go stare at your phones and the tea will be ready in a moment." My brother and I did as we were told, but my parents turned on the television instead of looking at their phones. For a few minutes we stayed in our separate worlds, only returning to the present when my great-grandma brought in the tea, and we had a nice time. But I wasn't allowed to eat it until well after supper. I stared at the clock, so I know. Yes, that one on the mantel there. The brass and chrome one. Same one. But I stared at the clock, so I know night fell at 6:41. That was the moment bright orange stopped glinting off that clock and my mother rose to light a lamp. I looked up at her. "Now." She smiled and shook her head. My brothers and sisters complained in a chorus in support of me, but she just shook her head at them. "Too soon and she'll ruin her supper." Father came in from the fields not long after that, dirty and tired as all get out. He ate in silence while we chattered endlessly about what type of cake it would be. Under the frosting, who knew? It might be raspberry, vanilla, or even chocolate. We grew silent as Father neared the cleaning of his plate, an event which would mark the end of supper. 4 pieces of meat and bread remained, then 3, then 2 any moment now. He stopped at the last piece, holding it unmoving above the remaining dollop of gravy. We turned our heads. It was the bell. The bell was ringing out in the fields. Father grunted, then put the last piece of his food back on his plate before rising. He opened the front door. We braced ourselves for the wind, but none came. He spat on and held up a finger to the night air, then shook his head. He moved back into our lamplight and sat. Arthur asked, "Is it going to storm?" Mary asked, "Is there going to be a tornado?" My mother shook her head, smiled at us, and told us not to worry. No wind meant no storm. But that bell kept ringing. My father dipped his last piece of food in the gravy and prepared to eat it, despite the constantly ringing bell, but then sighed and put it back down. He motioned to Clarence. Clarence was the oldest, so he understood. He was nearly a man himself, and tying the bell would be no problem. He grabbed a candle, protected the flame with his hand, and headed out the open front door. My brothers and sisters and I piled up to the window. Opening it, we found nothing but absolutely still chilly air. We watched his little spot of light move out around the house and into the fields in the direction of the bell. The clanging metallic sound stopped finally, and the candle's little flame hovered next to it for a solid minute. "Why is he taking so long to tie it?" Ruth asked. Our mother laughed. "Ruth, be a dear and go find your silly brothers." Ruth was a little hesitant, but she accepted the lamp. Leaving us in darkness without it, she headed out around the house and into the fields. This lamp was brighter, and we could actually see her carrying hand and her white pajamas in a small lit halo. On the way there, she regularly called out, "Clarence, Arthur, you two lost." About halfway to where the other two lights had stopped, her calls went instantly silent mid-sentence. "Clarence, Arthur," it wasn't that she'd given up yelling. The sound reaching us had simply stopped completely. We could still see her carrying the lamp, still see her hand in pajamas, still see her turning this way and that. She even raised the house lamp near her face, and we saw her shouting into the darkness. We just didn't hear anything, nothing except that constantly clanging bell, growing faster in pace and louder in urgency. "Mary, Eleanor," and I looked up at our parents with fearful gazes. My father shook his head, speaking for the first time that night. "So there's wind out there after all. The air is like a river inside an ocean. It's moving fast out there, carrying her voice away. But we can't feel it here." My mother seemed worried, but she nodded and accepted that. We saw her accepting it, so we gulped and believed it too. We all glued our eyes to that open window. Ruth reached the bell, and in that stronger light, it entered our view unmoving at the exact same time we heard it stop ringing. Ruth looked this way, and that, clearly concerned. She seemed to silently yell a time or two before moving closer to the motionless bell. A half-tied rope hung from the crook, an indication that someone had attempted to tie it. But we couldn't see Clarence or Arthur anywhere near her. She put the lamp down on the ground to free her hands for tying the rope the rest of the way, but that mostly hid the light among the lying recently harvested stalks. We waited, breaths held. The air held in my lungs started to burn. At long last, we were forced to breathe again. Ruth's light continued to sit there, barely visible between the broken plants. "What's taking so long?" Mary asked. Eleanor said, "I hope she's all right. Father told us she's fine. Damn kids are just playing a game with us." Our mother nodded in agreement. "Eleanor, go fetch your sister, will you?" Eleanor shook her head. "No way. It's scary out there. It's just a game. You're not playing a game with us, too, are you?" "No." Eleanor gulped. "Then go get your sister and brothers. Tell them to come back in." It was pitch black out there and almost the same inside with us, save for one lone candle. Trembling, Eleanor took our last candle and crept out into the night, scooting along the side of the house to stay as close to us as possible. Shakily, she called Ruth. "Arthur? Clarence?" This isn't funny anymore. Now it was we who sat in the dark. As Eleanor began to move further away with the last of our light, we tensed. Father eyed the open front door, and Mother softly moved to close and latch it. I wondered what they meant by that move, because how were the others supposed to get back in? But I suppose they'd unlatch it if anyone came back and knocked. Mother moved away from us in search of more candles. Through it all, the bell kept ringing out in the dark. Increasingly scared, I held Mary's hand tightly and yelled out the window, "Be careful, Ellie." She must have happened to cross that invisible silent threshold at that moment, because she turned around in surprise and stepped closer. "I heard your voice go quiet, but there's no wind. Papa's wrong." She stepped away again. "See, when I passed this point, she held up the candle to show us that her mouth was still moving, but we heard nothing. Come to think of it, her hair wasn't moving, and we hadn't seen Ruth's pajamas billowing in any wind. I asked Father, "What's doing that?" What's making it quiet out there? It's just a game, Father insisted. They're all lying. She's just pretending to make noise so it looks like she's being silenced. Eleanor reached the bell. Father's grip on my shoulder squeezed to nearly painful. She reached down for the lamp Ruth had left, lifting it with one hand and holding the candle with the other. She approached the clanging bell. "See," Mary whispered to Father. "The candle's not going out even though she's not protecting the flame. There's no wind out there." "But the bell is ringing," he said gruffly. "So there is wind." Eleanor kept looking left and right as if she'd heard something. Slowly, she reached the bell, which was hanging unmoving from the crook. But we could still hear it ringing. Next to me, Mary began to cry. "It's a game," Father said angrily. "It's just a game they're playing." Eleanor threw the lamp at something in the darkness. We saw the lamp crash, shatter and go dark, but heard nothing. She raced toward us, candle in hand, but the flame went out because of her haste. We waited to hear her approaching or screaming, but nothing followed. The bell continued to clang. We waited in terrified silence. Mother returned with a candle for each of us, and we sat vigil at the window. Nothing and no one moved. For hours the bell clanged without wind. The night remained pitch black. The bell clanged and clanged and clanged it, driving deeper into our ears with each passing minute. Near midnight we broke. Father was beyond agitated. "Mary, go find your brothers and sisters." "No," she cried. "I'm not going out there." Mother glared at her. "You have to. This game has to stop." Urged on by both of them, Mary burst into tears and climbed out the window. Holding her small candle, she inched out into the fields. Her sobs went quiet as she passed that same point out in the darkness. Her flame reached the bell, and the ringing stopped. Her flame snuffed out. We held our breaths. The bell began ringing again. Father clenched his fists. "Go." I turned and saw he was looking at me. I suddenly realized I was the only child left in the house, and I felt horribly alone. Everything in me shrieked against the thought of going out into that cursed night. "No." My mother wavered in place. No longer adamantly in line with my father, she began to cry too. "What are you doing?" he demanded. "It's just a game. There's nothing to be scared of." She screamed and demanded, "Why do you keep saying that? Why have I been helping you do this?" He grabbed her and shouted in her face, "Because we haven't been sending our children to their deaths. That's not what's happening." She pushed his hands away and ran for the window. Pushing past me, she tumbled out and ran screaming toward the still clanging bell. Not out of fear of Father, but out of terror for her children. Arthur, Clarence, Ruth, Eleanor, Mary, for God's sake, where are you? He growled and leapt out after her, yelling we didn't kill them. Everything is fine. They both continued shouting until they passed that point in the dark and all went silent, except for the bell. Twice more it stopped ringing, and twice more it began again. In panic and terror beyond reason, I closed and latched the window and pushed all of the furniture against every entry to the house. I curled in a cupboard, holding the last candle up to my face as it slowly melted its way down toward my fingers. I was alone. Somehow I was alone. We'd all seen the danger and stared right at it, as it happened, but one by one they'd all gone out there anyway. I'd been surrounded by a full band of siblings my entire life, and now I was completely and utterly alone in a house in the middle of nowhere. By the length of my candle, it was 3 a.m. when the knock came at the door. I trembled, but did not make a sound. The knock sounded again 40 heartbeats later. It was louder this time. I shook, holding my candle tight. The third knock was more like a tremendous crash or kick, and I heard the door explode inward. 60 heartbeats of silence passed, and then the floorboards creaked. Something in me told me to put out my candle for fear of it being seen through the cracks in the cupboard, but I didn't dare. Not darkness. I couldn't handle darkness. I would scream if I did, so I kept it lit. Slow, quiet steps moved through the house. Whoever it was seemed to be pausing and listening at times. At others, they would rush forward to a random spot in a sudden frenzy and then stop abruptly. 400 heartbeats after that, the bell began ringing again. But this time it rang from inside the house. It rang from the kitchen. It rang from near the bed. It rang outside my cupboard. Clang 10 feet away. Clang 5 feet away. Clang right up against the cupboard door. And then it opened. I sat expectantly, mouth open and eyes wide, as I waited for my great-grandmother to continue. After a bit, I realized that was it. But what'd you see? She shook her head. That's not the point. I'm here. So obviously I survived, and a young man like you doesn't need to know what horrors walk this world outside the paved cities of man. Gulping, I asked, You're not just pulling my leg. This really happened? Yes. Her gaze went distant by television light. But here's what I want to tell you, and what you should tell your brother. The thing that opened that cupboard door and stared at me from the dark, the thing that hoped to wait out my candle before the coming of dawn, had a bell tied to one of its teeth with a blood-soaked rag, such that it would clang when its mouth was opened for hunting. Somehow, some way, some heroic poor soul managed to tie a warning bell to that thing before they died. We heard that warning bell all night long, and yet my entire family walked out there one by one. We didn't listen because we didn't want to listen. My father knew what he was doing halfway through, but he didn't want to accept what he'd already done, so he did even worse to continue living the lie. I narrowed my eyes. What are you saying? She grabbed my hand briefly. Fear will tell you to put your candle out, but your head will tell you to keep it lit. Don't give in to fear. You keep it lit, you'll get through this. Turning my head, I became aware of a sound in the distance. Is that the bell? I was so caught up I didn't notice. How long has that been ringing? She just clenched her fist and turned back to the television. The night I met Santa Claus. It has been said that you should never meet your idols. It was the Christmas of 2005 that I came face to face with mine. Someone the majority of people don't believe in, after a certain age, of course. I was 10 years old at the time and still held on to my beliefs, regardless of the inherent mocking it would earn. Joanna, my older sister, Joe or Jojo to her friends and family, outright laughed at my insistence the man in the hat was real, but she was always a logical thinker. Even when she was much younger, while I was only 3 or 4, she rolled her eyes at my excitement about the arrival of jolly old Saint Nick, having never bought into it even when she was just a little girl, according to our dad. That's fine, I thought. Don't matter if you believe in him, 'cause he believes in you. Not the most well-thought-out inner argument, but it was good enough for an imaginative kid who couldn't stand the thought of his sister ending up with a stocking full of coal, even if she was being a jerk about the whole thing. When that December dragged by at a snail's pace, or so it felt to a kid eagerly anticipating whatever new goodies may be awaiting him on the morning of the 25th, I forged together my plan to prove her wrong, once and for all. Sure, I can't deny that the satisfaction of having a well-deserved "I told you so" to greet Joe on Christmas morning wasn't at least a little bit behind my motivations, but I also couldn't resist the opportunity to meet the fabled jolly man in the red suit. My dad chuckled at my insistence that I would be camping out in the living room that night of the 24th, while my mom only shrugged with a smile. "Just be sure to get some sleep, kiddo," Dad said, still laughing at my eagerness mixed with exhausted yawns. I held the small camera I'd received a Christmas or two back, clutched in my hand beneath the blanket, prepared to take a few shots as soon as Saint Nick made his appearance. But as the house fell still, I found it far more difficult to keep my eyes open. While the couch wasn't nearly as comfortable as my bed on the second floor, the excitement of the season, along with a good deal of playing out in the snow, left my eyelids far too heavy to battle against. I can't be certain how long I was out for, with only the lights from the tree illuminating the living room around me. But when the creaking of the floor and jingling of the decorations hanging from the tree caused me to stir back to awareness, I instantly felt my fingers tingle with anticipation. For my plan to prove fruitful, I would have to keep up the act of a sleeping child, one fully unaware of the visitor I could vaguely see through my half-shut eyes. From the angle I was laying in, I could only make out from the waist down of the man who fished goodies from his hefty bag, laying them gently beneath the tree. But I had no doubt I was witnessing the actions of the very man I hoped to see. With his back to me, I softly but hastily searched my fingertips around for the camera which had fallen from their grip after I knocked out, but I attempted to keep my actions unnoticed. I slightly gasped aloud when my hand wrapped around the plastic shell, causing the man by the tree to spin in place, almost catching me red-handed. I snapped my eyes back shut, rolling them from side to side beneath their lids to imitate the rapid eye movement I had read about online. Whether or not I was overdoing it, acting as though I were erratically scanning them in every direction while still firmly closed, I had no way of knowing. But when I felt the air shift as the man drew closer to where I lay, I found it more difficult to hide my excitement. I breathed in the scent of freshly baked cookies and peppermint, convincing me that I truly was in the presence of the fabled gift-giver himself. There was something else beneath the more inviting smells, something musty and aged, but I assumed the big guy had worked up quite a sweat, given his laborious profession. After a few moments, I felt the oxygen around me regulate as the light footsteps sounded as though they moved away from me again, so I took a chance on cracking open my eyelids. Sure enough, the man in the red suit was hunched over by the tree again. I knew I had to make it quick, or I would lose this small window of providing evidence to my sister. In one swift but silent motion, I pulled the camera free from my blanket, aimed it at the man who still faced the tree, and snapped 3 pictures back to back, moving my finger so quickly I didn't have time to register the bright flash. I felt my breath catch in my throat as he spun to face me, something I could barely make out through the lingering effects of the blinking bright lights on my eyes, which had grown accustomed to an otherwise darkened room. "That's against the rules, little boy," his deep voice said with his posture unchanged from what I could tell. I'm so sorry," I stuttered, feeling my eyes well up. "I just wanted to prove to my sister that you're real. You're not the first, unlikely to be the last, but it is still forbidden, I'm afraid." I could see the silhouette rising back to his feet, with the blotches of lingering light still blocking most of my view. He moved closer to where I lay, only slightly raised with the camera clenched between my trembling fingers. It wasn't fear that caused my extremities to shiver, but that sensation of guilt and embarrassment from being caught doing something I shouldn't have. Were this any other man, I would likely be so scared that I couldn't even form the stuttered words I managed to utter. But I was comfortable in the fact that Father Christmas would never harm a child, regardless of how naughty they were acting. "Give it to me," he said, holding his padded mitt just beneath my face. I gently raised the camera, placing it in his waiting hand, keeping my guilt-ridden gaze fixed on my wrinkled blanket. "There's nothing to feel bad about, my boy," he said, sliding the camera into his pocket with one hand and tousling my hair with the other. "Go back to sleep now." But, will I mean, does this make me naughty?" "No, young Mr. Cobb, you have graced my nice list exclusively for years," he said with a hearty chuckle. "I was a curious child myself once, so very long ago." Finally feeling comfortable enough to raise my eyes to meet those of the man who stood beside the couch, I found my voice silenced when I met his smiling face. While things were still somewhat out of focus from the lingering effects of the camera flash, what I saw through the haze was far from what I expected. Whether it was the fact that the skin tone of the left side of the face was not the same as the right, the green and red threads holding the mismatched flaps of skin together, or the 2 different colors and sizes of the eyes were what caught me more off guard, I didn't know. Whatever aspect of this crudely priced together thing, for lack of a better term, I was certain that this could not truly be who I had expected a visit from this snowy Christmas morning. As my jaw fell open, a scream caught in my throat as the creature in the red suit swiftly and firmly placed a hand over my mouth. Now, he said, smiling so widely that a few stitches popped where his mouth was hemmed on the left side. "There's no sense in allowing your curiosity to wake everyone else in the house." I was frozen when the sight of this patchwork man caused my guilt to be replaced with a fear I had never known. My whole body trembled as the one green and one hazel eye glared into mine. Tears were streaming down my face and over the padded glove that rested over my mouth, while my mind fought to wrap around what I was looking at. "There's nothing to fear, my boy," he said, winking the brown eye, his words now accompanied by a whistle through the gap on the side of his mouth. "I may not look as you imagined, but I assure you, I am who you sought to meet this night." What are you?" I asked, pulling the hand from my mouth with my shivering fingers. "You know who I am, Edward." "No, you can't be." I shook my head almost violently as I pushed my shoulder blades against the back of the couch, as though this would somehow grant me freedom from this hideous thing. The smile faded from the patchy bearded face as those opposing eyes glared down at me. While he hung his head, turning away from me, he strolled to my father's recliner, which sat diagonally across from where I lay. When he spun again to face me, lowering himself into my dad's favorite chair, we just glared at one another, my eyes still filled with terror, and his with something resembling shame. "I have been doing this for a long time, Edward," he said in a strangely compassionate voice. "Immortality, I can assure you, does not come without cost. You can't be him." "I won't believe it," I said, still shaking my head in denial. "I am young Mr. Cobb. I am so sorry that I am not what you expected, but I assure you there is no need to be afraid. I would never hurt a child. Not even the naughty ones? Not when they're still young enough to change anyway. Even if they're really bad? Not ever. Never a child. Not if I can help it. Besides, that's what the train is for." The train? Nothing to concern yourself with, my boy. I can promise you that much." Again, we gazed at one another for so long that my eyes began to burn from my refusal to blink. Not only was I still so horrified by what sat across from me, but I dreaded to think what he might have done if I took my eyes off him for a second. My whole body continued to tremble while I still forced my back against the plush cushions of the couch, with my blanket pulled up to my quivering lower lip. Every fiber of my being was in complete denial of what I was looking at, regardless of the fact he clearly had no ill intentions at the time. A fact I grew steadily more uncertain of after what came next. "Stop looking at me like that," he said, barely louder than a whisper, both sides of his uneven brow pinching tightly on his upper eyelids. I didn't stop. I couldn't. I had no control over it at the time. He may as well have asked me to levitate 3 feet above the cozy sofa with how much I was able to manage what my body and mind were going through at the time. "Stop it," he repeated, leaning forward to lean his elbows on his knees. "Do you have any idea what I have endured over the centuries? Do you have the slightest semblance of appreciation for what I put myself through to continue to give you ungrateful children a happy Christmas?" I shook my near spasming head, not in response to his question, but in further denial of what I was witnessing. "I turned myself into an abomination for you and all of the other kids out there. Is that not good enough?" I turned away from him, finally allowing my gaze to drift from his. "Look at me," he shouted, reclaiming my unyielding attention, as he practically leapt to his feet, whipping the hat from his scalp and tearing open his coat. The scars and stitched together, mismatched shades of flesh across his emaciated chest almost caused me to scream out so loudly, I may just wake the dead, as well as my sleeping family. The stringy and matted, patchwork hair and mangled scalp looked as though the thread holding it together would pop apart any second, unzipping the seams to reveal little more than the skull beneath. "This is what I had to become to continue on my chosen path," he said in a cracking voice, pulling his coat back shut. "I became this monstrosity for you, for all of the children of the world." He paced closer to me again, inspiring me to attempt to force myself deeper into the cushions. As he crouched down to look directly into my eyes, my tears let loose, transforming from the trickling stream to a veritable hurricane. "Stop. That." He gripped his fingers around my shoulders so tightly, I thought he planned to claim my arms, to stash them away for a rainy day. While I became aware of the fact that one of the hands felt so much larger than the other, far stronger as well, that only drove the madness of it all so much deeper into my brain. "Look at the wonders I brought you," he said, removing one hand to gesture to the pile of neatly wrapped presents. "Is it too much to expect a little gratitude?" The mismatched scowl softened to reveal his own glassy eyes, glistening in the soft illumination of the festive lights upon the tree. In that moment, even through my horror-stricken vision at the time, I could finally make out the melancholy and hurt-filled expression of the kind face, hidden away behind the grotesque patchwork flesh. Thank you," I said, my tears finally dissipating. "And I'm sorry. Sorry I got scared. It's just—" "No," he said, his grip softening on my shoulder. "It is I who should apologize, my dear young man." His hands fell limp to his sides, tracing his padded gloves across the carpeted floor. As he hung his head, shying his eyes away from mine, I let the blanket slip from my fingers, raising my hand to his cold and wrinkled cheek. "It actually feels kinda neat," I said, running my no longer shivering digits across the seam, holding the upper flap of his face to the lower. "Does it hurt?" He just shook his head, still seemingly studying the floor beneath his knees. "Only at first. Goes numb after a time. I bet that's a good thing when it's really cold out," I said sincerely, shifting myself closer to him. "I played in the snow today, and my skin felt like it was on fire after a while." "Is that right?" he said with a chuckle, raising his eyes back to meet mine. "It has been a long time since I felt anything like that. It really sucked, 'cause I wanted to stay out there, but I couldn't even make my fingers move. They were so cold. When I came back inside, I got crazy pins and needles." Though the smile he returned seemed to lighten up his face, a few more stitches popped loose on the side of his mouth, almost reawakening the fear I had begun to bury away. When he raised a gloved hand to the loose thread, I could see that shame returning as he turned his gaze from mine once more. "Want me to help you fix it? My mom showed me how to sew a bit when I kept tearing up the knees of my pants." "No," he said, with a half smile on the side of his mouth that wasn't affixed with thread. "But I certainly do appreciate the offer, young Edward." With that, he got back to his feet, smiled back down at me once more, and walked back to where his bag lay beside the tree. "I'm afraid I must be going, my young friend. Many more children on my list before the sun rises." I pulled back my blanket, jumped to my feet, and approached the man in the red suit, no longer afraid of what he had in store for me. "I really am sorry, Santa," I said, feeling my back tense again from my guilt. "No, my boy," he said, turning to face me. "It is I who owes you an apology. It has been many years since I have allowed this," he held his hands to his face, "to be seen by anyone, aside from those I work alongside. I almost forgot how jarring it can be to the unsuspecting." I reached up to wrap my fingers around the puffy mitten of his left hand. He winced at first, as though shocked by this act, but when I tightened my grip to reassure him, I felt my heart skip a little when my hand closed around the empty section of padding. I looked up at him, as though wordlessly asking if it was all right before I slipped the glove from his hand. I felt my jaw fall loose when my eyes met the sight of the 3 missing fingers, leaving only a forefinger and thumb in their stead. What happened?" I stuttered, not from fear this time, but from the sadness awakening within me. "A small accident some weeks back," he said, almost dismissively. "Nothing to worry about, young lad. Can you get new ones?" "Soon enough, my boy. I just need the right donor." he replied with a warm smile. But you said you wouldn't hurt nobody, I said, feeling my heartbeat quicken again. I would never hurt a child, dear Edward, he said, pulling the mitten back over his hand. But a few lumps of coal are not quite as effective to a naughty adult. With that, he gave me a wink, tousled my hair again with his fully fingered right hand, and picked the large bag back up again. You'd better get some sleep now. While I was still pretty freaked out by everything that night had presented me with, I no longer felt afraid of the patchwork man in the red and white suit. Before I walked back to the couch, I wrapped my arms around him, apologizing one last time for acting like such a jerk. He just laughed, gently returning my hug. "Merry Christmas, Edward Cobb," he said with a slight crack in his voice. "Merry Christmas, Santa," I replied, finally releasing my grip to head back to my warm blanket. When I climbed back under the covers, I glanced back to the tree to see no trace of jolly old Saint Nick, but I think I expected that. I heard no hooves stomping across the roof, high above, no jovial chuckles as he rode out of earshot, only the silence of the house at rest. By the time I awoke the following morning, greeted by my loving parents, excited sister, and a good many presents to open up, I had already convinced myself that I had eaten far too much junk food the night before. That was always a safe enough explanation for my more bizarre and far-out dreams. I even found my camera hidden away beneath the blanket, with not even one picture having been taken. After Christmas morning proceeded like normal. Well, normal from what I had experienced over my handful of years by that point, my father received a phone call. He looked almost puzzled when he glanced at the caller ID before answering, but the confused expression on his face quickly turned to something more concerned and uneasy. He whispered to my mother words I could not make out, causing her face to mimic his at the time, but he turned down her offer to accompany him as he threw on some warmer clothing, almost sprinting out the front door. "Where's Dad going?" Jo asked, turning her attention away from her new iPod for the first time in hours. "He has to go meet your Uncle Bob," Mom replied, appearing uneasy about this rendezvous. I had only met my father's brother once, some 4 or 5 years before that Christmas day, if memory serves. Even back then, I could tell that my mom didn't think too highly of the man, but he was only at the house for maybe 10 to 20 minutes at most. I overheard my parents arguing that night, with my mother insisting that Dad's brother was not welcome in our home. While Dad seemed pretty agitated by her words, he didn't put up as much of a fight as I expected, but the more they talked, after the yelling calmed down, the more I understood. I would find out sometime later that Robert Cobb, who was 2 years older than my dad, cared more about the bottle than his brother's family. He prioritized his addiction over his own wife and kids as well, for that matter. Having only met him that one time, I had no idea I had 3 cousins. A boy around my age and 2 daughters, 3 and 5 years my senior. With those facts in mind, when my dad showed back up 2 hours later, accompanied by Uncle Bob, I could understand why my mom looked fit to burst. As my father looked back at her with his eyes quivering with burgeoning tears, she looked completely lost for words when Robert threw his arms around her, apologizing for being such a terrible brother-in-law. It was at that point, while I was completely distracted from all of the goodies I had unwrapped that morning, gazing up at the adults who were acting so strangely to my youthful eyes, that I noticed something that caused my breath to catch in my throat again. Some minutes later, Bob would explain the bandages wrapped around his left hand, how he had awakened that morning with a wide red ribbon where the gauze now sat, being still hung over from the binge drinking of the previous night, the same way he had ended just about every day since his wife left him, taking their children with her. He had no memory of how he had lost those 3 fingers, nor why he had encased the bloodied stumps in a festive ribbon. Seeing this as a much-needed wake-up call to finally put in the work To attempt to get his life back on track, he headed straight to the hospital, placing the call to my father when he arrived. When my parents escorted him into the kitchen, pretty much ordering my sister and me to stay put, we couldn't help but listen from the other side of the door. Though I was still far too young to truly understand a lot of what was being said, what Uncle Bob was confessing to, Joe attempted to explain it to me later in more child-friendly terms. Essentially, Robert admitted to the abuse he had inflicted on his wife and children. While he had only gotten physical with his spouse, he was just as ashamed of that as the years of verbal abuse. Over the following months, my father stood by his brother's side while he fought to get clean, with the full support of my mom. Sometime down the line, his estranged wife gave him a second chance. Ultimately, they could not save their relationship, but remained friends, even when she remarried. He would, however, become far more involved in the lives of his children, as well as his niece and nephew. To this day, Uncle Bob keeps in touch. I don't see him as much as I used to, him or my cousins, but that's just part of getting older, I suppose. We all still get together for Thanksgiving and Christmas, the latter being more important to my uncle than any other holiday, as that is the anniversary of when he realized the monster he had become. Oftentimes, I allow myself to believe that the memories I still hold of the man I met that early Christmas morning are nothing more than an especially vivid dream that sticks with me to this day. The fact that the patchwork individual in the red suit was missing the same fingers my uncle lost track of some hours after that bizarre dream, I just chalked up to that unexplainable coincidence of a strangely prophetic flight of fancy of the sleeping mind. Of course, there are those other times when I fully and truly believe that I did uncover the truth behind the mythical saint of the season, the extreme measures he took to be able to continue his mission through the centuries. Not only that, but I think it is very likely he had a fully fingered left hand by the time the sun set on that Christmas day. Though I never saw him again after that night, I believe it was that experience that drove me to at least attempt to grow up to be a good man. That, as well as the lessons my parents taught me. Yes, there have been hard times that almost inspired me to stray from that path, as life does tend to toss a few curveballs at even the most prepared for the worst. But I have always been able to find my way back. Perhaps it's not the most honorable motivation, the fear of having bits and pieces of myself cut and stripped away to fix up a broken fender or two on Santa's sleigh, so to speak, but it's something at least. Believe my story or not, it's pretty far-fetched. I can't deny that. All I ask when all is said and done, just try to be good, for goodness sake.